You're listening to a social justice podcast hosted by Nicholas Sperling, brought to you by The Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book. Hi, I'm Nicholas Sperling, and this is a social justice podcast. This is a podcast brought to you by The Flag Shop to explore various different social justice issues. And today I'm joined by two very special guests. On my right here, we have Celine, who is an aerospace engineer, a clean energy engineer with over 10 years of experience in the private sector, primarily in manufacturing and engineering consulting. And then we have Devyani on my left, who is our second guest and who's a scientist working on climate and energy policy, currently working with the Environmental Defense Fund on natural climate solutions. Your other research includes energy access and transitions, sustainable forestry, oil and gas emissions, and environmental finance. So we're going to get into some questions around what the climate crisis is all about. That's today's episode, is the climate crisis. And these two bring a wealth of knowledge on that subject. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I anticipate that there's going to be a lot of back and forth because we've seen that already, just sort of getting ready for this. And I think it's time to get right into it. So my first question, which is to both of you, is what is climate change?
If I was going to start in as fast and simple as possible, the Earth is the Earth is in a state of energy balance. The energy comes from the sun, like visible light, all that good stuff, heats up the Earth, and the Earth loses heat to the rest of space, basically in every direction that the sun isn't. And that's in balance largely because that the gases that make up the atmosphere are transparent to visible light. But some of the gases in the atmosphere are not as transparent to heat, which is infrared light. Mm-hmm. And because of that, and those gases, may you believe, are called greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide and methane, but a lot of other ones too. But those two are the biggest drivers of their increase in the atmosphere, means that while the amount of energy coming in is constant, as it always is, the amount of energy that's able to escape the Earth is limited, which makes the Earth warmer. And the reason these gases are primarily CO2 are coming from the burning of fossil fuels, which are sequestered carbon, like huge amounts that have been under the Earth for hundreds of millions of years. And while the Earth is in a stable system most of the time, we're driving that system out of balance by adding more greenhouse gases, primarily CO2 and methane, from fossil fuel sources, that is making the Earth's energy balance reach a higher, another equilibrium, but at a higher temperature. And as that temperature happens, all of the weather systems are just thermodynamic engines, and everything we've ever known, loved, and experienced in human culture and existence is now being thrown out of balance.
Right. That was an incredible answer. Thank you.
I know, that was like a very good explanation of what's happening. And so, you explained what climate change is, and what I like to usually tell people is tell them the difference between natural climate change and anthropogenic climate change. Because this often comes up. They're like, well, I believe in climate change, but it's natural. We have no role in it. So what is it that I mean by this anthropogenic climate change, which is what we talk about when we say climate change, climate emergency. So everyone's heard of, we have had ice ages, we've had warm periods, and so it's a cycle the Earth goes through. It's like, I like to call it, think rolling hills in Iowa. I used to live in Iowa, and they do have rolling hills over there. So gradual up and down. Now what's happened is, as humans, since the Industrial Revolution, and which was good, we needed the energy, it brought around a lot of progress, and we didn't know better than we do now, and have for a few decades. Which is a whole other misinformation campaign done by oil and gas. Don't get me started on that. But what we've done is, so think of the rolling hills, and now you're going on this rolling hill, and suddenly we've made it into a cliff in the Himalayas, where I'm from. So now instead of going like this, we've taken this jump, right? And we've created this steep upward in a matter of a century, which if it was in the natural regime, should have taken hundreds and hundreds of years. So what happens is, when we push up these temperatures drastically, we aren't giving people and the planet enough time to adapt, which is why we're in the third largest extinction event in the planet. If we were slow, species would adapt. If they would evolve to the warmer climates, like we have, like, we had dinosaurs, and well, they didn't really die off because of climate change. That was
They
nice,
did
right?
great. They
But
did
we
great for a long time.
They did great for a long time, for millions of years. And so, like you get, there's time to evolve and adapt. And so what most of us, when we talk climate change, we're talking this, you gotta now climb a cliff and get a degree in rock climbing rather than just being able to trot over those gradual hills. And not, as we know, it's really hard to just pick up rock climbing. Everybody can go for a walk on the spot. So think of that as adapting for ecology. It's really hard, and that is what is creating these crazy weather patterns. It's creating extinction level events, agriculture collapses, global instability. And so that's the anthropogenic part of climate change.
Right. So climate is always changing. It's just that humans' impact on the climate is amplifying that significantly and making it difficult for all species, including us, to exist.
The
Exactly.
rate of change is unprecedented in natural systems. That is the human element.
Right.
We're doing a speed run.
Fantastic. Well, not fantastic, but great explanation. So you've touched on this already in terms of fossil fuels being sort of the biggest impact on climate change. Are there specific sources that you can kind of pinpoint as far as fossil fuel extraction methods or burning methods that are
It
causing
doesn't
that?
matter. The shortest answer is, and this is like, if you're looking at it as a thermodynamic system, we're not getting into details. We just here's the Earth.
Right.
The issue is that fossil fuels are amazing because they are such energy dense sources of energy that are just there. They're already underground. We don't have to do anything to process them. We just have to get them out, combust them. This is all amazing stuff. We are so fortunate that we live in a chemistry that this works. But the thing about it is they are like coal, oil, and natural gas, and they're all basically a spectrum of the same stuff. It really doesn't matter. But the thing is, when you burn it, for every, all the fossil fuels are basically a combination of carbon and hydrogen. For every carbon-hydrogen bond that you burn, that's where you're getting the energy from. But every carbon atom in that molecule, when burned, will form carbon dioxide. And every molecule of carbon dioxide is making the Earth's atmosphere more opaque to the heat, which is making the Earth hotter again. The short answer, it doesn't matter how you get the fossil fuels out of the ground. It doesn't matter which fossil fuel. The issue is when you combust them, that's the problem. Full stop.
So understanding that, I guess my question is more sort of around, are there specific industries that are extremely bad when it comes to being sort of the world's worst
You mean fossil
polluters?
fuel? You mean fossil fuel intense?
I suppose. I'm trying to think of,
You mean
is there a
within fossil fuel?
Just within climate change in general, is there, or can you pinpoint specific industries that are really damaging to the environment? That
Buildings, transportation, industry, and agriculture are the 4 biggest drivers of emissions in the world. And like I say, buildings, that is just making them habitable. We're talking heating, but we're also talking cooling, because within buildings is also, depends if you count it separately or not, is electricity generation. Buildings, electricity, transportation, heavy industry, and agriculture are the biggest drivers. Within that, we can break it down in all sorts of different directions. Yeah, like transportation, the biggest culprit are light vehicles, like cars and light trucks. But that's primarily because there's just a lot of them, not because, heavy trucks and trains, are actually more efficient, but they're heavy and there aren't as many, so they don't show up until you get to it later. The airline industry is big, but at the same time, per person, they're not worse than small cars. And with buildings, we can go through it, there's the issue of, is it making concrete releases a ton of GHGs, but then heating the buildings, of course, powering buildings also releases a ton of GHGs. So we've already gone through transportation, electricity, and the building sector. In heavy industry, it's not just for the electricity. A lot of it, fossil fuels are essential for the chemical processes. Like making steel, you have to you need the carbon to turn iron into steel, and most of the ways you get that and the high temperature is by burning a kind of coal called coke. But aluminum similarly needs high temperatures, but we usually get that from huge amounts of electricity. And in agriculture, the big thing is you need the whole supply chain of vehicles and fertilizer production and irrigation and soil remediation and clear cutting and making farmland. Like, we can go on and on and on in agriculture, but it's using vehicles that do that. And then separately, there's land use changes. Land use changes, I usually don't focus on those because I'm like, land use changes are a big driver, but they're only affecting the carbon that's already in the circle of carbon that's already going along. It's the extra carbon we're shooting into the carbon cycle from burning fossil fuels from all these sources that I just outlined in this big five.
Right. I really appreciate that because I think it helps to sort of put into perspective what it is that we're trying to accomplish when we're saying we need to reduce GHG emissions, for instance. Like, what industries are we looking at needing change, and sort of how does that change occur?
Yeah, and I like to usually, like you said, like with those industries, if you look at it, it's really what we call energy production, right?
Yes.
And so with transport, you need the energy, which is oil and gas. With electricity, there's still a lot of coal-fired, and so within like energy production, we have coal, we have oil, and then we have gas, which I think we need to come up with a different name from natural gas, because there's a whole different conversation. It's natural,
nothing.
but people tend to think natural means good.
Right.
And when you can just say methane because it's largely methane. And so it's methane gas or fossil gas. And so when it comes to that, yes, coal in terms of energy production is the dirtiest because of, like you said, the amount of GHGs. But it doesn't mean that as our governments and people around the world in the oil and gas industry try to say that it is LNG is clean energy, it is not. And I can tell you this, my research for 2 years was on oil and gas emissions. I was at oil and gas sites with infrared camera. Everything is leaking methane. Methane you can't see with the naked eye. And our inventories in Canada are underestimated by almost 2/3 of when it comes to methane inventories. And so it's not clean. None of it is clean. What we need to do is we need to transition to cleaner sources of energy away from coal, in terms of, we want to say first coal and then oil and gas. But it doesn't mean we use gas as a bridge fuel anymore. We've run out of time for bridge fuels.
It's far too late for that. And the short answer is, if we really wanted to put a number on it, by 2050 we can't be using any fossil fuels. Full stop.
People like us, like Canada and other developed countries, need to do it a lot sooner to give developing countries the time to catch up, because they still need to develop. And so when people say Canada will do net zero by 2050, that's too late, actually. We need to be doing it a lot sooner to buy the planet time for developing countries to be net zero by 2050.
So when you look at like the BC government, for instance, moving forward with fracking, and they're saying this is clean because we're electrifying it and we're getting our electricity from hydroelectric dams, you would say, well, it just needs to stay in the ground because that's the issue.
It absolutely does. The shortest answer is you absolutely there is no good fossil fuel. It has to stay in the ground. And the other thing is, what they're talking about when they're saying they're electrifying, they're not electrifying fracking. Fracking is high pressure hydraulic fracking, and that's a mining technique. What they're talking about electrifying is the compression pumps to drive the pipeline system. This is what, here's the thing, the energy used by the airline industry, the amount of emissions that come from the airline industry globally is about the same as the emissions that come from the pipeline industry, because you have to run all the motors to move the mass that goes through them.
And pipelines leak.
Yeah, but I mean that's a whole other thing. But from an engineer's perspective, the worst thing about a leak is you're wasting energy.
Exactly.
And of course, the thing with natural gas is the double whammy is when you burn natural gas. There's different greenhouse gases they're not all the same strength. Some of them hit harder.
Like methane.
Methane, if you burn it, it becomes CO2, which is let's say it's the standard. It's 1. It's a CO2 value of 1. If that methane leaks, it's a value of at least 30, depending on how you measure the time period. So over the life, from well to furnace, if even 3% of the natural gas leaks out in the process, that methane you have now exceeded the GHGs of burning coal.
Exactly.
And the whole system, therefore, it's incumbent to know where you're leaking, which is exactly what the work you do.
Exactly.
And you're saying
and everything leaks, and that, like you said, and because methane is CH4, and when it combusts, it becomes CO2. But like you were saying, it's something called I don't know if people understand what global warming potentials are out there. And so it's a great time, what you were saying with the value of one, to explain it to people, because we often hear this. What is the global warming potential? So carbon dioxide over a 100-year period has a global warming potential of 1, which is like, what Celine said, is the baseline. Now, when we talk about methane, if you look over 100 years, it's about 30. But if you look at a short term, because methane actually doesn't stay in the atmosphere for that long as carbon dioxide, over a 20-year period, it's closer to it's like 80 or 90. It's 80 to 90 times worse than carbon dioxide.
And those 20 or 30 years are the key ones that we need to achieve
Exactly.
net zero. So that's a great point. And I just use the 30 one because I'm just like,
that's what IPCC uses.
No, it's because as an engineer, I'm just like, I don't need the details. I'm just like, But the point is, the only difference is you're arguing what is the leak rate that then makes it worse than coal. And the whole thing is that's why why they underreport, because as soon as it starts looking worse than coal, it's just hiding the emissions.
And also, when we're talking just upstream production, what we call upstream, which is like producing natural gas, there's, like I said, everything is leaking. And, but here's the thing, leaks out of all this methane that's released in the production process is probably between depending on it, between 20 to 45% of those emissions. So what is this rest of this 60 to 70%? That's venting. And venting is mostly allowed by law. Basically, when they have too much, they just vent it into the atmosphere. Sometimes they flare it, which becomes carbon dioxide. So if you go to these oil and gas sites, you see these big fires. That's them flaring the methane. But sometimes they just vent it without flaring it. And that's actually allowed. So even if we were able to detect all these leaks, it's called leak detection and repair, LDAR methods, which we use in the oil and gas industry. Even if we were to get all of that and make all leaks zero, we still have 60% of emissions that are legally allowed right now. And so we really need to cut down on that too. And when you said 3%, and that 3% they're talking leaks, if we account for venting, it's already almost as dirty as coal.
And that's why there's no good fossil fuel.
Exactly.
There's no good way. There is no ethical fossil fuel. There's no ethical burning.
You mean our ethical oil campaign in Canada?
I mean,
why do we buy a pipeline then?
After saying declaring the climate emergency.
I actually want to speak up in favor of the TMX pipeline.
Okay.
Because it doesn't a pipeline isn't like other infrastructure projects. The TMX hasn't delivered a single barrel of oil because it doesn't do anything until it's finished. It's just a waste. It's a white elephant at the time. If you could build, we need more pipelines. Sure, just build them. Go pipelines to nowhere. Political projects. It's not like we have nothing. Nothing in this country needs fixing. Let's just build pipelines. We're fine. But it doesn't increase emissions because it hasn't been finished.
Oh, so for the jobs perspective.
The ideal would be to build it and never use it. If you were really...
Although, technically, it does have emissions because all the material for producing and then all the clear cutting and then we have all the equity issues, with First
all of
Nations
those. But those are farther upstream and those are minuscule compared to the emissions associated with the oil that it would transport.
Exactly.
And burn. The real thing is, every time when we talk about the oil sands and intensity of extraction, whether it's regards to fracking, if you think about what's that movie? There Will Be Blood. That's people think about or think about Bugs Bunny and Wile E. Coyote. Whenever you think of them pulling out oil, it's like Yosemite Sam. You drill down and it shoots out of the earth, right? And 100 years ago, you really could do that for oil and gas. It was already pressurized by the weight of the earth over it. And that is the lowest emissions of extraction because all you need to do is drill down a hole and Yahoo, you're a rich Texan or something like that. But the thing about that is a lot of the political discourse about the fracking takes a lot of energy you have to break the rock and then hold it open and then pump in this fluid that is completely unknown because it's proprietary and then to extract the gas that way. And with the oil sands, you have to, depending on the system, you have to separate. It's basically like peanut butter. And you've got to remove the sand from the peanut butter, and sometimes it has to be removed in situ, 3 kilometers down. So you've got to pump steam down there, and how they get the steam? They burn natural gas to do it. So we're talking about huge amounts of energy going into the extraction, but that still pales in comparison to the emissions from burning the oil at the end of its lifetime. So
which is what we don't talk about is what we call Scope 3 emissions.
Yes.
Right? And so when Canada is saying, we'll be net zero, but we plan to literally export the amount of emissions we have we plan to export those emissions. Basically, by the amount of oil that when burnt would be the same amount of emissions as Canada. So are we net zero? Because that's our oil we are pumping and trying to send across. And that's scope 3.
Yeah.
That is the most important part. So scope 1 and 2, it's easier to reach net zero because they're very little. Like you said, the scope 3, that is the issue. And we can't export our emissions because I don't know whether our politicians get this or not. Whether we're burning oil in India, or we're burning it in Africa, or we're burning it in Canada, it's still impacting our climate the same amount.
Right.
And the thing, and just to take a step back so people understand that when we're talking about scope 1, 2, and 3, and we'll probably get into this more, and we're jumping all over the place because caffeine's a hell of a drug. A big issue is when you're talking about climate change, just how do you measure it and who is responsible is a huge ethical question, because a lot of nations that have been oppressed by colonialism or that didn't exist, say 70 years ago, will rightly point out and say, all of you wealthy nations had centuries to exploit greenhouse gases for the enrichment of your world. Why are we not allowed to also, we suffer a downside but none of the upside? Who are you to tell us we can't use fossil fuels to enrich our people's livelihoods?
And on that topic, and it's true because I worked on getting clean energy access in the global south. So, about almost 2.6, 2.7 billion people, that's a lot of people, burn wood every day to cook, right? And so people are like, oh, we need to get them away. But the thing is these people don't have basic energy access, right? There's 1 billion people on the planet who don't have access to electricity, and the other billion don't have intermittent access. And right now, India, Pakistan, that whole area is going through a intense heat wave. Temperatures way worse than what we experienced in our heat dome last year. And these people don't even have electricity, so no fans, no air conditioning. These people are dying. And then we think that we as countries, as developed countries, have the right to tell these people, oh, please don't burn coal to provide electricity to your people that are dying. How is that even fair? It is our job. And yes, burning coal is bad, but then you know what? It's our job to help them grow in low carbon pathways. So we need to provide them with the financial help. We need to give them the technical help. And we need to give them the human resource capital, where we know how to, let's say, this is actually a very interesting discussion I was having. I'm trying to connect it. So what we saw with the vaccines and we saw with COVID is that right now we keep coming up with these variants because the world isn't vaccinated, right? And the developing world had put in a petition to remove the patents for the COVID vaccine so they could produce them at large and give it to their people, right? And obviously Canada also voted no because we want to make money, right? And so we didn't remove the patents. So think of this now in the clean energy transition. This is our job. If we start patenting new clean energy stuff, then we're not helping those developing countries. It's our job. And because there's a lot of innovation. Every day I'm reading about something else they've come up with that bacteria that eats methane, bacteria and creates energy. There's this and that and all kinds of cool new innovation coming. It's our job to help the developing countries, give it to them so that they don't have to rely on dirty sources and have a carbon lock-in. What I mean a carbon lock-in is we're locked into carbon. We've got infrastructure that's going to work for another 50, 60, 70 years and on carbon dioxide systems. When these countries are growing, they need to be building new infrastructure. Let's not tell them to build fossil infrastructure, which is like providing LNG in BC to China and India.
Or providing the funding to build coal plants.
Exactly. Because then it's going to function for the next 60 years. We should be giving them these clean energy help where they are building these systems that for the next 50, 60 years will be producing clean energy, right? That's what we need to be doing. And so there's a lot that we need to do. And like you said, we need to take this colonial past and we cannot put the blame on developing countries. They're just trying to get energy to their people.
And if we're saying that something is too expensive for us, or it's working Canadians can't afford this, working Canadians are some of the richest people in the world. If it's too expensive for us, how do we expect nations that are are only at a fraction of the relative per capita wealth?
A lot of people in India don't even earn $1 a day.
Yeah, and we focus on burning wood, but wood is already part of the biogenic carbon cycle. That's less of an issue than, say, running your air conditioner with windows open.
Actually, I would like to my whole research was on burning wood because the way they burn wood is so inefficient, which you would understand in terms of the thermal transfer, the energy transfer, and the main issue is it produces black carbon.
Yes, it's a
And
health
so
concern.
It's no, not just health, very climate concern, especially in a place like India, where most of the black carbon, it's the black carbon, which comes mostly from cooking in that area, is one of the major reasons for the South Asian monsoon failure and the accelerated Himalayan glacial melt.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so black carbon, when we were talking about global warming potential, something like over here could have 100 factor, but in places like India, it could be in 2000. Something like that. Black carbon is very regional. It only stays in the atmosphere for a few days, but in that few days, black carbon is the soot. So when we have wildfire effects here, imagine that being normal. So that's why the wood burning is a big issue because of the black carbon. And in places like India, where it goes and settles on the glacier, increases accelerated melt, and the South Asian monsoon failure, the whole country, like most of Indian agriculture depends on the monsoon for its farming. And so when that fails, we lose farming, we lose farmers, and we have mass farmer suicides every year when the monsoons are late.
Yeah.
So that's the issue.
And I appreciate you bringing that up, because I only see things primarily as an clean energy engineer. I sort of hand wave away the environmental stuff because I'm like, no time for that. I'm like, I'm just concerned about the GHG going in, and I'm only looking at things like, well, if you burn wood is carbon dioxide forms the carbon in trees, and that's already part of the cycle, so it's less of an issue than the fossil fuels. But you're absolutely right. Like, this is because I'm simplifying the entire Earth to a single circle, and which is also how I simplify my understanding of biology.
That's like totally normal, right? And I think that's why when we sit here and we try to like come up with these solutions, people don't realize that on the ground reality is very different. And like you said, health issue is major. 3.7 million people die every year from indoor cooking. Women actually, it's one of the, for wood, they go for wood collection. It's one of the biggest reasons the girl child is kept out of school. That's when they get attacked, they get raped and murdered when they go to the forest to collect wood. So it's women health issue. It's a forest issue. It's a climate issue, and so we need to give them what we call clean cooking, which is what I worked on. So, and ironically, the cleanest form you can get in places like India is actually an LPG cook stove, because of its high efficiency and its low climate impacts because people are like, oh, but kg to kg LPG is bad, which is liquefied petroleum gas. But here's the thing. 1 kg of wood is not being replaced by 1 kg of LPG. Like, it could be 100 kg of wood being replaced by, and so actually I have a paper on that, which you want to read, and I actually did all the stuff.
I'll read the abstract, I won't read the rest.
You don't need to read the rest, but that's...
But I mean, and that's a really, really important, when we're talking about, when we get to the topic of mitigation, talking about the marginal effect of each change, because if you just take the simplified thing where, like, I'm just talking about the Earth as a circle, every action the same action once or twice or 3 times is not going to have the same impact the first, second, or third time.
Exactly.
So this is why it is really important when we start actually implementing things to talk about the marginal effect of different methods, policies, or technologies.
Oh, but I do want to say one thing, because I don't want people to misquote me on that, because they've said this. Oh, so they're like, so you've been promoting that people should cook on gas in India, so they should cook on gas. Yeah, I'm like, no, here we have electricity access. We shouldn't be having gas stoves. In India, we don't have electricity, so you can't have people wait until the lights come on to cook their food.
Yeah.
So that's why we need gas there. But if we could 100% electrify it, that is the best.
Yes.
I'm also sensing that there's a sort of a generational aspect to all of this as well, where previous generations have been able to exploit fossil fuels, whereas younger generations are saying, well, why are you making my life difficult? Like, why don't I have the same ability to exploit this as you did? Right?
And there's an element of that too, but when we say generational, we also have to take in a factor of geographical distributions of generation. But on the topic, the idea of scarcities or the supply chains of fossil fuels, which has always been connected to colonialism and cannot be separated. The interesting thing, my actual great-grandfather was a low-temperature physicist, German-Jewish refugee in Britain. They came over in the 30s, and when the war broke out in 39, he was like, well, how can I help the war effort the best using low-temperature physics background? And his first idea was, he would see if he could develop the idea of liquid hydrogen long-range airplanes so that they could fly.
Cool.
Wow.
But he came up, doing the case study, he decided that doesn't look like you could get a practical application before the war be over. So that's not you got to have a deliverable. So he said, oh, okay, I won't do that. So he said, okay, the next most effective thing I could do is work on this new tube alloy thing, which is the development of the atomic bomb and understanding uranium and nuclear fuels as a source of electricity and power. And so this is in the 1930s. I really want to emphasize, and like to be clear, the neutron had only been discovered in 1935.
Yeah.
Like we're talking, these are not new questions, it's a new urgency.
Right.
That's the thing that I really want to emphasize, that
And we haven't funded the right things. And being in the sciences, I can tell you, we're underfunded. So we've like you said, the fossil fuel supply chain, the whole thing is connected to colonial, and that's the thing, we've funded the wrong things.
It's
We
amazing
haven't
how
funded
much
the
can
right
be
things.
accomplished when a war is happening.
I know, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the things that I notice whenever I'm looking at engineering videos of like this engineering marvel, and so many times it was just because countries were at war and it
But we are
sparked
at
innovation.
war. Like
Yes.
in a way, we are
Look
at
at
war
the-
right
right,
now, and
the-
we need to wake up and work together as a freaking
Yes.
planet.
Well, that's just
Yes.
it. You have to focus on the climate emergency as being as important as a war.
and
or more
everyone's
important
equal.
because
We
it
need to
is.
work together. Everyone's equal as a planet. And that is the way we will solve this. Not by
Absolutely.
saying, we're cool, we're Canada, we're
Yeah.
going to make a border, and we're going to only look out for our people, and we're going to just screw the rest.
Absolutely.
No, that's not going to work.
Because one of the things, and I know we're jumping around, but one of the things that makes climate change such a wicked problem, and I use the term wicked not because I'm from the Northeast, because I'm not, but a wicked problem is one where there are so many interconnected facets that, A is connected to B, and B is connected to C, and C is connected to A, so you can't, by changing A only, you can't solve the problem because B and C will get worse. That's a wicked problem, is one in which all the different pieces make it seem almost impossible to fix unless you do everything at once. One of the things that makes climate change such a big issue is that it's we use fossil fuels, the benefits right now in focus, whoever burns it gets the energy. Yay. But the downsides of climate change are dispersed and long-term, but they're also invisible, and there's also, the human brain is really bad at thinking about future things. Like if you have it, this is why debt is such a big problem. And nobody doubts that money is real, and we still are all in debt because we have a hard time appreciating the future value of things.
Right.
But then once you start talking about with the virus, which you can't see, or with GHGs, which you can't see, and as soon as and stretch it out longer than a human lifespan, it is very, very, very hard and people do not intrinsically understand the problem. They might not even see the problem intrinsically because they can't see, hear, or touch it the way you can,
An asteroid hurling to Earth.
yeah. But and that's the other thing. And a part of the reason why can we do so much engineering and war that we can't the rest of the time, most of the time is because the stuff we don't do in engineering is mostly because it's not cost efficient. Like, if I spend $1 billion on this thing, I'm not going to get $1 billion back. Nobody's going to spend $1 billion.
And that's where the funding comes in.
Yeah,
We need to be funding the right things.
And the government is able to, the Manhattan Project is probably one of the fastest, most complex, the Manhattan Project being the development of the atomic bomb during the Second World War, one of the biggest government design, build, research projects ever. Makes the moon shot look like, kindergarten. But even that they don't expect a return on investment. The big thing is governments can make these big steps, marshaling huge amounts of power, resources, human power, intelligence, access to everything, but they won't usually do it because it's a money sink.
Right.
But in a crisis, you have
And we are in one, right?
we
And
are
that's what we need to be doing.
we are in a slow burning crisis, which is what makes it so much harder to deal with this than to handle a war or even the pandemic. The pandemic is a fast burn wicked problem, and even that, look how hard it is to just that. People are saying it doesn't exist even when they're dying from it.
I know,
If people's own loved ones are literally dying from something and they're saying it's not real, it's so much harder to convince something of a thing that's going to happen.
And
Well,
you
it
said,
also-
because of all these, these things, and also the isolated impacts of climate change, not just the time period, but currently, right? And so, and I say media is to blame. How many times have all these things happened that the media actually said this was made worse because of climate change? They stay quiet on that. Last year in Vancouver,
Credit to the CBC for being one of the few that does.
and that's the thing. And last year, we had almost every crazy once in a 100 millennium year event happen in Vancouver. I mean, we started with the heat dome, which was a once in a millennium, and now it's going to be a once in 5-10 years event. You know, we had that
More often
cyclone
than
bomb.
not.
We had a freaking water tornado, okay, near UBC. We had the coldest winter in 50 years. We had atmospheric rivers that cut off Vancouver from the mainland, like from the rest of Canada by road. And then we literally
And another
had
atmospheric river. Then we had a second atmospheric river,
exactly.
just in case you
And
didn't like the first one.
That's what I mean. And then we had a whole town burn with the wildfire season. And so, you know, when people, and these are all, and these are all individual impacts of climate change. Climate change didn't cause them, but it makes them more frequent and more intense.
Yeah.
And that's what climate change does. And so people are like, we've always had tornadoes, we've, like in places, or we've always had droughts, and we've always had rain, and we've always had flooding. Yeah, but the intensity and the frequency is what becomes way worse with climate change, and that's what we need to talk about.
And I think what you said about the sort of the slow burn aspect is a big issue, because when you look at COVID, you think about how seriously everyone took it for a year, maybe 2 years, and now people aren't really taking it seriously. It's like we're past that time period of being able to focus on the issue.
Yeah. And I just want to also point out that 500 Americans are still dying every day. So that's like
Yes.
a 9/11 every week. And I bring that up, I always bring that up because look at 9/11, happens, and we spent trillions of dollars like invading the wrong
and kill,
country.
like thousands of innocent people too.
Yes. And I'm like,
Right.
and whereas with the, now this has happened, we just have to live with it. Like the idea of, there is so much of human psychology that is a major issue that we're barely even touching here. But it's what makes it so hard to convince or explain to so many people.
And I think you can convince people temporarily, it seems, but not long term. Like
You have
whenever
to keep
you
convincing.
see,
You have to keep re-convincing them.
right, because you see those atmospheric rivers, you see forest fires, and people kind of go, "Oh, okay, we need to take action," and then a month later,
I mean,
No one wants to take
Every
action.
time fuel price spikes, I'm like, oh yeah, it's just like the last time Russia invaded Ukraine. You remember in 2014 when we all had enough warning and Europe didn't do anything to just insulate all their places, and oh no one could have predicted this. Like
And
even
on the
this-
prices, like
Yeah.
it always goes up when something happens, but have you noticed they never go back down when the crisis ends?
Oh, well,
or they
they-
go down a tiny bit. but not-
Exactly.
No, the real way they go down is through inflation. But anyway, I don't care. I don't like. As a free market economist, why should I care about the emissions of other people? I don't drive a car, so not my problem. I'm really adamant about that. That if gas prices are high, let the free market and individuals figure out ways to use less gas. People are smart. They'll
For
figure
me,
it out.
that just comes into an equity issue. Sometimes there are like people who really have to use or there are places where even in Canada and BC we still have places that don't have energy
once
access and they have to burn
But
diesel.
once again, and I always bring up the Second World War a lot because my great grandfather actually was instrumental in it, in a lot of the big aspects. But my grandmother, who is 94, still alive and remembers all this, we rationed fuel. Like we had public awareness campaigns that don't waste oil, carpool. Nobody can say that
No, I agree with that, but I'm saying there are First Nations communities that have diesel generators because they don't have
Yes.
electricity access and things like that,
Yes.
and they can ration it. But here's my thing: for me, that it's not a free market issue. That for me is an equity issue that
And
we should
yes.
be, doing a lot
Oh,
to
and but
provide
that's
the
a huge,
First Nations with.
but that isn't because they don't have this because of the market. They have it because of genocide.
Exactly.
Yes. So
and that's what I mean. So for
Yes.
me, like if I'm like, let it happen. For me, there's equity issues that I'm concerned about. Like, of course, like we shouldn't be driving, but we should also be providing, more public transit at affordable rates and things like that. So for me, it goes beyond the pricing and all of that and emissions. It becomes more of a justice and equity issue.
Right, because then you end up with instances where only the poor people are being told to carpool and the rich people are just driving their
Exactly.
big cars going, oh, it's great that everyone's off the road and now I can just
Exactly.
race around and do whatever I want.
But that's always the thing. That's literally the history of being a rich person. That is the definite. The rich people will always be able to do more.
Oh,
and richer,
absolutely.
And
I don't
afford
agree
to-
with that.
Yeah, but I mean, and the whole thing is, unless you ban the activity, unless you were to say ban driving on roads, no matter how much more expensive you're going to make it, there are always going to be billionaires that can afford to do it. So unless you ban the activity or ration it so that everyone gets a fixed amount of it, which I bring up again because, once again, this is what Britain and the Allies did during the Second World War and actually created more equity for, especially in the food supply. Like, the poor people in England ate better during the Second World War than they did before because they had better access to nutritional foods, because all of a sudden the broad health of the nation was important where it hadn't been before.
And well, we actually had that happen not too long ago, where we were told you can only pick up 30 liters of fuel. It wasn't enforced.
That's not rationing. That's not rationing. That's like
because they could just
Yeah,
go
well,
30
no, I
here
mean-
and go to another pump
Yes.
and get the.
No, well, that was the thing, is how it was introduced. Like, it was presented as if it were rationing, but it wasn't actually acted upon in that way.
When we talk about it like that, if we talk about the only way we could, the only way you can address the inequality of billionaires being billionaires and doing what they do, is you either have to ban the activity in its entirety, or you really do have to ration it. And
I'm actually okay with banning billionaires.
I'm like,
I'm okay with that too.
Exactly.
yeah, but I mean,
But we're not
Go-
so much
go for
talking
it.
about banning billionaires. It's
no,
like,
but I mean ban the activity you're talking about. That
Right,
if you don't
exactly.
if you don't want billionaires going on private flights when all of us are told take the bus, you got to ban private flights. You can't say, well, we'll just make it so expensive. Like, billionaires will always be able to afford more than we can.
I mean, we saw they all want to just go spend 7 minutes in space.
No, I love that. As an aerospace engineer, I welcome every billionaire on Earth taking on the risk profile of an astronaut. Do you understand what
Oh.
do you understand what the mortality rate of astronauts is? About 1%. I'm in favor of that being applied to every billionaire on Earth.
quite like that in perspective.
I'm like, the biggest idiots you know, like the biggest egos you know.
It's like
and-
I heard somebody who said that, oh, I don't mind the billionaires, they should all go to space, but we should have 100% billionaire tax for re-entry.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
you can
No
stay out
hand-
there, just
no
don't come
handstand.
back.
It's like PEI. Have you been on the bridge to Prince Edward
Yes.
Island?
No.
Yeah.
It's like
I
you can
haven't,
get
but-
there for free, but you can't come back for free.
Oh, really?
Well, that's like the grouse grind too. But I mean, like, as an aerospace engineer and clean energy engineer, like, I really, once again, I don't care about billionaire space programs because y'all don't understand the risks. Like, and
Oh, yeah.
they don't understand the risk, and you're about to find out quite quickly that, no offense to programmers out there, but y'all ain't engineers. Like, being a programmer when your air filter doesn't work isn't gonna save you. And I'm like,
Right?
like, sorry, not sorry. So, good luck. Yeah, good luck up there.
Yeah, have fun. I want to ask you about the intersection between being an aerospace engineer and being a clean energy engineer. And are those two spaces of engineering compatible, or are they, like, do they contradict each other?
And aerospace engineering, this is like, I started out in my education as an aerospace engineer, wanted to work on the space program, wanted to be an astronaut. Number of factors, cut that off right away, like, it was never going to happen. But the thing I'd like to say, when people talk about aerospace engineering is just mechanical engineering with a weight fixation. Like, and I mean that in the sense that, you know, when we're talking, the stuff about it's about engines, and it's about engines in the same way it is about cars. Like, it's all the same stuff, but you have to make it light enough to fly. That's the only. So you can't have any extraneous weight. So everything has to be designed down to as little as possible. Like, there's y'all know Saint Antoine d'Exupéry, or Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, sorry, the writer of The Little Prince. He had a saying that the definition of perfection is where nothing remains to be removed. Like when there's nothing extra to be taken out.
Kind of a minimalist concept.
Yes, absolutely minimalist. That's aerospace engineering. Aerospace engineering is, you have to design it so that there's nothing extra. It'll do exactly, so you need to know what it's going to need to do and design it to do that, but you're not going to have any extras. And so in the strictest sense of aerospace engineering is crucial to clean energy engineering, because we really need to figure out what do we need energy for, and we need to figure out systems that we really can't afford the waste or the extra because we don't have enough capacity. That being said, the aerospace engineering industry is very much tied to the military-industrial simplex. It's not a complex; it's just a straight line. But so there's very much in, like, you know, NASA has more buildings named after literal Nazis than it does named after black people. Total, like, full stop. That is true. Like, you know, when you really got to think about it, like, it's only so. I'm getting on a side topic, but when you talk the ethics of the aerospace engineering industry, like, what ethics? Like, but that's because engineering is, and science in particular, most scientific degrees usually have not been connected to any ethical framework or guidance. They are used as tools in service, like, aerospace engineering. Aerospace engineering has really only existed, unless you count hot air balloons, it's only existed for 120-ish years. So, but I mean, it's intrinsically linked to all global politics of the last 120 years, and you can't take that away because it's so performance-based. Aerospace engineering is invariably expensive, and because it's expensive, it is, available. The more power and wealth you have, the more access to aerospace engineering you have. It's like that's why, which is part of the reason why so many nations make space programs a priority, even when they have bigger issues that probably should be addressed. It's a prestige program because it demonstrates a level of power or wealth just to be able to put something into space.
And do you think it's necessary to put things into space?
I mean, to argue about what is necessary or not is a broader philosophical question that I would have a hard time arguing.
So I'm thinking of it more so in the instance of being in a climate crisis. Like, is it necessary during a climate crisis to be sending things into space,
Yes.
or is it counterproductive?
No, we absolutely need to be sending payloads into space for Earth monitoring. That's the first, second, third, and fourth. This is the biggest way we can actually, a lot of the stuff we do when we're talking about climate change and carbon inventories are based on just how much carbon, oil, and natural gas we're burning. But that can have mistakes, omissions, and outright lies. Whereas if you're monitoring the atmosphere or the land use from outer space, this is like, the security technologies we have are intrinsically linked to the Cold War, but the reason they started doing that is from space, you can see if somebody's building silos or airports or something, and the same technology allows us to see, wow, a lot of the forest is burning, more than even we thought, because a lot of it's not close to where it's observed.
In fact, we have methane monitoring satellites now. The EDF just launched one of its own as well to monitor oil and gas emissions from
And
space.
a lot of the technology that was developed for that was developed from the space program to detect methane on other worlds and earlier stages of it. So
I'm sensing that there's sort of some common ground here around the need to expend emissions to put monitoring systems into space.
And the other thing being that how do we rank necessity if not by cost? And especially with the space program, like the basic rule of thumb is it costs to put a kilogram of mass into orbit takes $10,000. And that's the baseline. That's not even counting the cost of, well, what is that 1 kilogram going to cost to make? Because it's going to be, you really got to focus on, once again, aerospace, no extra weight. You got to make that 1 kilogram count for everything, and that thing's going to be really expensive.
I watched a documentary on a helicopter going to Mars and the amount of effort that went into designing it so that it was like small in size, light in weight, not just for being able to fly on that planet, but also for the transportation.
Absolutely. And you've got to think about, and when you have something that complicated means expensive. And once you say it's expensive, then it's like, well, the cost of fuel, nobody cares about the cost of fuel at that point because it's negligible. So even if you said compare, that's the thing. It's you could make the argument that a lot of aerospace engineering is what you call value added, and you're adding so much value into it. You wouldn't do it unless you were getting a lot of value out of it. Stealth, whether it's a stealth bomber or an Earth monitoring satellite, they're so expensive that you wouldn't do it unless the reason you're doing it can't be achieved some other way.
Right.
If there were other ways to do it, you definitely would do it because it's so damn expensive.
Fair point.
So this is why I'm saying when you argue about necessity, the argument is like, well, it's expensive, sure, but anytime we'd rate how is it necessary, it really falls into the systems we use to decide what is necessary in the rest of our lives, societies, and economies.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason I'm asking the question is because I often see whenever there's a news story about a rocket going up or something along those lines, there's always people saying we should stop doing this because it's polluting the environment. So
and it depends on the fuel.
Okay.
When we're talking about launches and people are saying, oh, but what about the emissions of the fuel? And this is one of these things that gets talked about the space program a lot too, about, the cost. And it's like, sending the Cassini probe to Saturn costs less than the American expenditures on chapstick, in any given year. That, with regards to fuel, the shuttle liquid tank, the big tank on the shuttle, was filled with hydrogen and oxygen. When you burn that, the emission is water vapor. But when you use solid fuel, it's a number of different things. The real problem is it's toxic, but it does produce GHGs. But on a lot of newer rockets, and I'm not just singling him out because he's an asshole, but I'm also singling out because it's a bad design choice. In Elon Musk's rockets, they use methane because it's cheaper, but by using methane instead of hydrogen, it does produce significant greenhouse gas emissions. It does produce those in a way that, say, using the more expensive fuel of hydrogen, the way they do in the shuttle, and also, for the record, most of the other sort of heritage military industrial simplex rockets, using hydrogen doesn't produce the emissions and is also less toxic than a lot of the other options. So that's why we always have to be careful when you're talking about, like, every time you see all the emissions coming out, you're just seeing water vapor. That's the misleading thing. Water vapor, it's just like, condensed steam. You don't see the really bad stuff. And that's, once again, what people see is a bigger risk. Like, when people show a factory and show the big plume, I'm like, that's water. That's not even the problem. It's that you can't see what the problem is.
When people view space travel or space research as being negative to the environment, it's because they're seeing things like the steam that you're talking about, right? It's not the actual emissions, but they're also seeing the destruction. Like, they're seeing, a car floating around in space, or they're seeing a rocket blowing up, and they're looking at the material and the amount of emissions that go into creating that material, for instance. So,
but I would make the argument, what difference does it make to have a car launched into space doing nothing as opposed to sitting in somebody's third garage doing nothing?
Well, that's an absolutely fair argument to make, for sure.
It's one's more visible is the issue.
Right, and so that just comes back to why I'd asked that original question around, is it sort of ethical to be sending things into space?
You asked if it was necessary,
well,
not
that's
if it was
true.
ethical.
That's true.
There is a difference.
Good catch. There is definitely a difference. I sort of view, or I'm interested in both, I suppose. So if you have a different answer around the ethical component.
My answer to the ethical component would be, what is the ethical system by which we are evaluating it? Because there isn't this is one of these big things. This is if I haven't mentioned it or if this has been edited out, I'm a free market, pro-capitalist person, not because I think they'll always make the wisest decisions, but because any other system of economic system, and this is an idealized free market that I support, is because anything else is just concentrating the decision in a smaller and smaller group of people. And same with the ethical framework. How do we don't have a universal ethical framework in the world. We barely even have universal even not killing people isn't even an ethical standard that everyone believes in.
This is why we have a social justice podcast.
Right.
But there's so many issues in the world.
How can I talk? So when we say, is it ethical, I just, under what framework?
Yes, and I'm thinking more within your own moral compass.
Within my own, I would say the aerospace industry with regards to space launches is much less of a concern than, say, going on a flight for a vacation. That's a bigger ethical priority because that's a much bigger thing. If you remember when I listed the big five? If I extended that list so far down that space programs was on that list, we would have outlined things that, the beauty industry, the pets, having access to contraception, education of miseducation and undereducation of women and AFAB folks. We'd hit so many other things on that list before we even got to space programs. That's why in my own ethical evaluation, I'm just treat the space program like everything else. Treat it like it's a transportation sector. Just treat it like Ford. Let them pay their carbon tax. Don't give them an exemption, but let the chips fall where they may. The bigger issues in aerospace are the ones we is it ethical to fly down for snowbirds? To be a snowbird, is that ethical?
Yeah.
That is a bigger concern with the before space programs.
I think that's a very fair point to make, and I really appreciate that perspective as well, because I don't think people do realize how far down that might be in terms of emissions on a global scale.
Yeah, or even on a national scale, even on a state scale. We're talking about Florida here, Florida and Texas. These are not anywhere near the top 1,000 sources of emissions. We'd be talking about the lawns. Even just talking about the lawns.
Don't get me started on the lawn industry.
Yes, before we get to space programs, space programs are incredibly visible, and people say, well, all of this stuff, and it only affects a very small number of people, and usually those are very rich or very educated people, so who cares about their jobs, sort of thing. But it's easy to politicize.
But
And
that
it's easy
monitoring piece of the equation, I think,
Yes.
would
That's
run
huge.
counter to that, right?
And it's huge. Space monitoring is probably the most useful element of the space program. You make the argument that humans don't need to go into space because robotics is advanced enough that we don't need to go Mars, we just send rovers. We keep sending rovers, that'll teach us everything that we could learn with an astronaut there. Like, you could make the argument that human space flight isn't necessary, but at the same time, the whole thing would be there's a lot of different scientific investigations that we don't know about that, we don't know that we don't know. So it's a harder thing to say. And I would hand it over to I'm not a scientist. I just make the rockets. What you do up there is your business. So that's how I'd say it. When you say, is it necessary? I would say it is not unnecessary.
Yeah.
And if you ask, is it ethical? It's not the least ethical part of the aerospace engineering business.
I think that's an avenue that we're going to find ourselves in a lot when we're discussing any social
It's
justice
ranking.
issue.
We got to rank.
Yeah.
It's always about rank. And this is a big thing in engineering. You got to rank sort of the impact of something and the cost of not doing it. And that's always huge. And that's why I'd be like, if you told me I can't fly back to see my grandmother, that'd be a more ethical decision than saying Elon Musk can't fly a stupid car into space it'd be more ethical to ban people flying to see family than it would be.
As far as the overall impact it would have
Yes.
on global emissions.
Yes.
What sent you down this career path of clean energy
Sure.
engineering and aerospace engineering?
These were sequential, not parallel. I always wanted to be an aerospace engineer since, as it would happen, the movie Apollo 13, which I saw when I was 6 years old, and the scene in particular, Star Wars and all that, I know it's not real. But I understood this is real. It's the scene where we got to make this square filter fit in this round receptacle using only the parts on this table because that's all they got up there, and if we don't, the astronauts are all going to die. That's when I wanted to be an aerospace engineer, that moment when I was 6.
So solving a puzzle.
Yes, it's the problem solving, the urgency, and the defined boundaries of a problem. Wanted to do aerospace engineering, got into an aerospace engineering program at UC San Diego back in 2006. Went down there to study. And UC San Diego, I bring this up because it's significant that I ended up there. I got accepted to other universities where I'm sure I fell out of love with the aerospace industry because once they canceled the space shuttle that same summer. And after that, talk about timing. Also, my lung collapsed, so you can't be an astronaut.
Oh my gosh.
So talk about timing. I knew I couldn't be an astronaut, and the jobs, they're just laying people off left and right. So I knew that the only option is the military-industrial simplex, which I wouldn't be eligible for because I'm not American, and which I'm not interested in because I'm not a war criminal. But I would have fallen out of love with aerospace engineering anywhere I went because the space shuttle would be canceled no matter what. The interesting thing is UC San Diego is one of the leading U.S. research institutes into climate change because the Keeling curve, which is the when they first started measuring the rise of CO2 emissions, was actually the researcher who was sent there was actually sent by the founder of UC San Diego, and they started a lot of the environmental and climate change research and integrating that with the research communities in North America and monitoring the effects on ecosystem. So I bring that up because there are 3 people at UC San Diego who I want to give a shout out to, who I credit for turning me. I was briefly, when I knew I wasn't interested in aerospace engineering, I briefly tried working as a high school teacher, as a teacher's attendant. I did 3 months in a classroom. Way hard. I realized I'm not cut out for it, and being a teacher is way harder than being an aerospace engineer. And if anyone else disagrees, they better have an aerospace engineer. They better have been both a teacher and an aerospace engineer. Otherwise, they're talking out their ass.
My mom was a teacher.
Yeah.
You heard it here, folks.
Yeah. If you haven't been an aerospace engineer and a teacher, and you disagree that being a teacher is harder than being an aerospace engineer, you're frankly wrong. Or as I love to say at parties, everyone who's an aerospace engineer, please raise your hand. Just me? Okay then. But anyway, I knew I didn't want to do aerospace engineering, but because of Professor Renkun Chen, Professor Tara Knight, who is actually an animator and part of the Culture, Art, and Technology. Renkun Chen was an engineering professor. Tara Knight is an arts and humanities professor. And Kim Stanley Robinson, who is a science fiction author, but also UCSD alumni and frequently would appear. I would credit the 3 of them for sort of turning my path and realizing Renkun Chen in particular was the first time I'd had climate change quantified for me in 2010. And I'd seen Inconvenient Truth and all these things, but Ren-Kun Chen put it in numbers. And as an engineer, nothing matters except numbers. And when you told, oh fuck, we are so fucking screwed, except that there's a tiny window that maybe we're not, and I've got the skill set that could do something about that. And that's the moment that I sort of changed course. It took me a couple of years. I got accepted to the Clean Energy Engineering Masters of Engineering at UBC, came here in 2013, and the rest is history. But that is the path. I credit particularly those 3 individuals for shaping my ethical and quantitative and narrative understanding of engineering at UC San Diego.
That's incredible. And that is a good tie-in to my next question, which is, do you see engineering as a means to overcome the climate crisis?
Absolutely. It has to be. Frankly, it has to be. And this is not the alternative to engineering is not the alternative to engineering is unprofessional. Is not the alternative to professional engineering is not like free of bias. The issue is the difference between professional engineering or unprofessional engineering. You're being an engineer whether you think it or not. The difference is whether you're doing it safely or not. Like that tailings pond dam that collapsed just recently, that was because literally was designed not by a professional engineer. That's literally why we got the damn rings, is to because stuff collapsing 100 years ago. For the record, I'm outraged that the bridge, the ironworkers, the Memorial Bridge is named after the bridge that collapsed in the 1960s for the exact same reason and cause that the Quebec Bridge collapse in 1912 happened. And the whole reason we have these damn rings, and there was still so I have bones to pick with the engineering society's standards and engineers in general in British Columbia, because they don't even hold up to the standards of Canada.
Jeez. Yeah, I remember that. My dad telling me about that incident because he heard the bridge collapse.
Yeah. And that was literally why they professionalized engineers in 1912. Like, this shouldn't happen, because that's the whole. So when you say is engineering, like Elon Musk is the alternative to engineering. It's just a guy like non-engineers sort of just saying, we'll fix it later, and if it kills people by accident because we didn't think that, maybe they wouldn't pay attention when they're on an interchange. One of the thorny issues is when we talk about control, especially at a global scale, do we have a democratic system between nations that aren't democratic internally? So it's
that's always the issue.
Yes, it's and how do you balance balances between power? Does the vote of China equal the vote of Kiribati, just because nation to nation? Or does the it's only 10,000 people versus 1.3 billion, but those 10,000 people are about a nostril above sea level. And it's
exactly, they're about to lose that whole home.
And we don't have an ethical system that has addressed this, and then it's because, how about we impose one upon the people, and tell people this is the fair way to do it, and it's like, who gets to do that? And the answer is the most powerful, and that's the UN.
Colonialism again?
No, it's the UN. Like, the UN, though...
But within the UN, too, there's, the most powerful countries that have most of the power.
Yeah, but the UN is founded... People forget, you know what the old name for the UN was, right? The Allies. The United Nations is just what you called the Allies during the war. It's all built out of all the successors, and it's an imperfect system, and I really want to go into this a little bit, so if you'll indulge me.
Sure.
The reason I bring it up is because the UN isn't the best intergovernmental discussion forum in the world. It's not the best. It's the only one. And the problem with it is this is the framework we have to use when we're discussing climate change. So this is why the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, they're the one that compiles the big honkin' report, released in increments every year, but doing a cycle of 5 years, sort of the, where are they now of, greenhouse gas emissions, the state of the world is what they're doing. But it's one of the biggest acts of scientific consensus and, in fact, scientific effort ever engaged in on the Earth. There's nothing comparable because there's never been anything that has achieved scientific consensus from all nations on Earth. That, in and of itself, causes problems because all the reports are incredibly conservative. And I don't mean that politically conservative, but maybe cautious is a better way to put it. It's incredibly cautious because they won't publish it unless everybody says this is true. This is true, and that's why it's for so long it was it's most likely caused by climate change. It's very likely caused by climate change. It's
Or,
almost certainly.
like high certainty, medium certainty, we
yes.
can say this. Like
And
those
as-
are the language
and,
they
yes.
use.
And as a scientist, you have to do that because one, it's unethical not to be clear about that, and two, you need to achieve a consensus among all world governments. As an engineer, I'm like mostly like it's likely that this is cause. Okay, let's just address it. I don't need it to be perfectly on. But that's part of the reason. And whenever somebody says, I don't, the science isn't settled, I'm like, it absolutely is. You just don't understand it.
Can I say something on that?
Yeah,
Because
no,
as a
absolutely.
scientist, like that's very interesting you brought that up because the problem is like you can never be 100% certain about anything, right? So in science we always say within like at 95% certainty or 99%, right? And that makes people think that the science isn't certain. What they don't realize is no, the science is certain, but here's the thing, like nothing is like set in stone, right?
It's
so
risk
you can't
ma-
be
it's an
exactly.
understanding of risk.
But when we say we're like 95% certain, that's like a very like that's a lot. And so what the oil and gas misinformation and all these did, they took that thing to say science isn't certain around climate change.
Yeah.
No, we have consensus. When you look at the thousands and thousands and thousands who agree climate change, when we said in the beginning anthropogenic versus natural. When I say climate change, I mean anthropogenic. And the number who say that it's not real and see who they're funded by.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
Same thing happened with leaded gas. Same thing
Exactly.
happened with
Tobacco
thalidomide.
industry also.
Oh, I forgot about them. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
the whole
like,
misinformation
yes.
campaign of the big oil was based on big tobacco.
Yeah, well,
And
you
actually,
gotta learn
like-
from the best.
Exactly, they learned from the best. And so, and what you're saying about the IPCC reports, like it's so true. I tell people, they're like, oh, but the IPCC is exaggerating. I'm like, actually, what you're reading in the IPCC, if that scares you, then think of that as the best case scenario.
Yeah, this is
because
the-
everybody agreed to
it-
that, which means what's actually coming is much worse.
This is why I say like this is why I said and this is why you gotta swear every damn time so people understand. We are like a hair's breadth away from being absolutely fucked, and that hair's breadth is in the best case scenario. We
Exactly.
might have actually missed that point by an arm's length, but we don't have the information on that. But we gotta act as if we still have that hair's breadth, because if we don't act like we have a hair's breadth, we'll miss that tiny slit of a
Exactly.
window. And if we don't act, then we miss it entirely. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. This is that doing
Exactly.
that shot. But the thing I also want to just double back on when you're talking about like this is once again it's a psychological thing that humans are bad at understanding risk. We're just fundamentally bad at assessing it. This is why charlatans do so well, like people that take advantage of other people because of their misunderstanding of risk, or due to illiteracy, and scientific illiteracy. The people don't understand what's being said to them, so they can be misled by savvy media teams. But there is something I want to address. When people say this is all new, this is all left-wing plot, these are all the thing I always want to address is there was somebody there was a world leader who in the year 1989 addressed the UN General Assembly warning of the imminent dangers of climate change, calling on global cooperation amongst all nations, and espousing and calling for a global carbon tax to address and reduce emissions. Do you know who that person was? Take a guess.
What year was this?
1989, in front of the UN General Assembly.
I forget his name, but he was the U.S. president.
Nope.
No? I thought-
You were in trouble as soon as you said a pronoun.
Oh. Because I know that the U.S. government has been speaking about, I don't know if they said it at IPCC, at the UN, but I know they've been talking about climate change being a threat.
No, they've been doing that's since the Keeling curve. That's really
Yeah.
since the 60s,
Yeah.
going up the chain of. But I'm just going to answer it since nobody's going to take a guess. In 1989, the person who warned the UN General Assembly about the risk of climate change, the global impacts, the global need for cooperation, and the global need for a carbon tax to address it, was Margaret Thatcher.
Okay, I was about to say
Margaret Thatcher, and it's worth remembering that when you say, it's an talking about climate change mitigation's anti-conservative, it's like, no, Margaret Thatcher is an actual chemist. The difference is most of conservatives now are run on, know-nothing campaigns, essentially, and are anti-science or anti-elitist. But Margaret Thatcher and the other woman I want to highlight, who is also a conservative is Angela Merkel, a quantum chemist. Both of them come from chemistry backgrounds. Both of them actually understand what they are reading, understand their scientific research project, understand the language, understand what it means. And so in 1989, if Margaret Thatcher advocating for addressing climate change urgently, imminently, and cooperatively, including cooperating with the Soviet Union.
So I want to ask you a little bit about your profession, but before we get into that, can you explain what a natural climate solution is?
Yeah, so I'll begin with natural climate solutions are basically using natural systems as climate mitigation tools, and they helping them play a role in reaching that 1.5 or a 2-degree pathway that we want. So what does that look like? The easiest thing that everybody can think of is afforestation and reforestation. Grow trees, pull stuff out of the air, right? So that's what we call removals of carbon dioxide. Then there's the reducing the carbon dioxide that's emitted. So that's things like stopping the deforestation of the Amazon forest. Because when you cut that, there's a lot of emissions that happen. So those are the two related to forests. But that's not only natural climate solutions. We can have, soil. Soil holds a lot of carbon, right? Improved agricultural practices, improved, animal agriculture. There's also talk about looking into oceans, where actually I didn't know this until a while ago. Did you know that whales? The fact that whales are going extinct and around the world is one of the reasons oceans aren't sequestering as much carbon, because think of the size of the whale, the amount of fish and other carbon-based organisms it eats. And then when it dies, these bones stay in the bottom of the ocean. So they're basically sequestering tons and tons of carbon. And so whale restoration could also be seen as a natural climate solution, right? Rebuilding fishery stock, all of these are natural climate solutions, and they have a role to play. So that's when we talk about natural climate solutions. So it's using nature in reducing emissions that we are putting out, and also pulling out the emissions that are of a carbon dioxide that are out there.
And so that is because I'm trying to think of that in relation to the information that we're told around cows being big polluters. So would a whale not release methane in the way that a cow does? Is it because they're consuming other animals as opposed to greenery, or
I don't know if anyone's done research on that, but I think a lot of the reason that the cows and all have a lot of methane release is the diet.
No, it's not. It's their specific digestive system. That's why cows and sheep are the worst in terms of livestock. It's because of they have multi-chambered digestive stomachs, which other animals don't. This is why rabbits, even though they're on more or less the same diet, aren't producing the same.
But I think also the diet we're feeding them in this mass farming, because I know that there has been research into giving a changing diet, and it reduces the emissions from cows.
It's still, but
it still have emissions.
The big thing is though, for folks at home, if you were going to make a diet choice, reducing the amount of beef and lamb and dairy are the biggest ones, because it's so much high. Even if you cut the emissions coming from beef in half, it's still way worse than other meats.
No, I agree.
But the diet's a part, but the stomachs, you can't change the stomachs of the cows.
Yeah.
That's what makes them so egregious. I just want to throw that in there.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and so, looking, and that's what we're saying, improved agriculture, shifting agricultural practices, which could be improved grazing practices, or, if people demanding less beef, then moving to small animals like chickens, because if people still want some animal-based kind of protein, the smaller animal.
Not quite ready to move to crickets, maybe?
I mean, actually, I think I'd read somebody in some research a long time ago, but looking at insects, and actually a friend of mine was doing research in how do they, in a lot of these refugee camps and all, trying to get them protein, and so insects is a very low impact way, and creating protein from that and getting it to refugee camps and things like that. I don't know a lot about it, but it was very interesting to see the research around that being done. But I don't know much about it at all.
If you just call them land lobster, it's so much if you people.
It's pretty much the same thing.
They are the same thing. It's just we have societal and cultural things.
We have that hot chocolate festival here where they always have the cricket. One of the hot chocolate places always has the cricket dipped in chocolate as a thing on the hot chocolate.
I used to eat crickets and ants from this. I think the shop still exists in Victoria, where you can go and get all sorts of candied insects.
Yeah. So I mean, we should be looking. Like I said, the smaller the animal, the less impact it is likely to have. I won't say it will. It is likely, because depending on the way you have it, what animal it is, it might. But I'm saying it is more it's less likely to have as much of an impact as a bigger animal and more intense, bigger farming.
Right, because I think crickets were supposed to be really good in the sense that they're very high protein. They don't require a lot of water. They don't require a lot of space. So you get like quite a lot with a small.
And I'm sure a deep fried cricket could be a great snack.
Nice and crunchy.
Probably, yeah.
I guess I'll pose the same question I posed to Celine, which is how did you get involved in this career path?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Indian Himalayas. Well, it was more like my father was a military officer, and so we moved around a lot, and we had a family home in the Himalayas. I used to spend all my summer vacations there. It was my aunt's house, and that's kind of where I grew up, and I grew up seeing all the nature and wildlife, and the Himalayas have they're just full of flora and fauna that's like just unique to those mountains. And I remember as a child, I loved it. These neon birds used to come to the chestnut tree in front of the house, and they used to be always, I remember them in pairs, like a neon green pair, a neon blue pair, and things like that, and they were beautiful. And I know this was even in the 80s, we were talking about global warming as we said then, and now we say climate change, which is more encompassing of the weather pattern changes that occur because of climate change. And as I got older, I started to not see those birds. I actually haven't seen them in a few decades. They've probably gone extinct or to higher altitudes. I started seeing wildfires devastate my mountains. I used to go hiking. I was hiking higher to glaciers and they were melting. And I felt really sad because this was my connection to nature. This is where I grew up loving the environment. But growing up in the 80s and early 90s, like there weren't a lot of career paths open to me. I wanted to basically be a wildlife warden, which is kind of like a ranger here, but as a woman I couldn't be then. And so the options were again, the usual doctor, engineer, business. And I definitely didn't want to be a doctor or engineer. And I said, what I'll do is I'll do business. In business, I'll do finance. I'm going to make shit tons of money. And then I'm going to open animal
rescue?
Yes, animal rescue, and I'll open up like an ENGO to protect these forests. So that was my roundabout way of, as a child, thinking about, how will I care about the planet? And so, got into the rat race, did a BCom honors in Delhi, and then it was obvious to go do an MBA, work in corporate, and so I ended up in the US to do my MBA in finance, and then I worked in corporate America as a senior financial analyst, and basically I was selling my soul. It was the most unhappy I had been. I had a 6-figure salary, and I had as a young person in my early 20s, I was successful in people's minds, but I was the unhappiest I've ever been. And one day I called my sister and I was like, I have everything what I'm told I should have in life, right? Like money, a degree, fancy car and things like that. And I'm like, then why am I the unhappiest I've ever been? Like I couldn't wait to get off work, and I was like highly depressed. And she's like, if you want me to be honest, she's like, this isn't you. You've only cared about nature and you're very disconnected from it. And that's when I realized, I'm like, I forgot along that rat race because society and our education system made me believe I'll be happy if I have money. I'll be happy if I have 2 cars. I'll be happy if I own brand name clothes. I'll be happy if I shop all the time. Stuff like we're told that will make us happy, but it doesn't. And I was so disconnected, and I realized I was, sacrificing environment and people to make another billion for corporates. Shutting down manufacturing plants in the US and moving them to Mexico because they can make more money by exploiting the environmental laws over there. And there was this dissonance, this fight within me, and I just couldn't do it anymore. So I took a leap of faith. I quit. I went on a soul-searching journey. Long story short, ended up going back because now times had changed. I was in the US and I went back and did a second master's in environmental science. And when I was doing that, I'm like, this is what I like. This is who I am, and I wanted to do more. And I also didn't want a 3rd master's degree. So I was like, I'll do a PhD. And I started looking around, and that's how I ended up at UBC in 2012, around pretty close to around the time.
Yeah, we overlap.
In the faculty of forestry to do a PhD. And that's where I met my supervisor, who actually had been an accounting person, an economics person who had gotten into, the environmental field. And he's like, what? Have you heard of environmental finance? And I was like, well, I didn't know a lot about it, I'll be honest, because I'd never had access to all this information. And he's like, you have all these financial skills, and don't give that up. Because at that point I was like, I want nothing to do with finance. That world sucks and it destroys the planet and it sucks people dry, which it does. But there's ways to use those skills to help the planet too, right? Like carbon finance, environmental finance. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. So I started working on that. Didn't end up doing my PhD totally on that. Ended up doing on energy access, which we were talking about, clean cooking and things like that, and then gone into oil and gas emissions. But now what I'm doing actually connects right back to this environmental finance. And basically, like when I started doing my PhD is when I was like, this is what I love. I'm doing something for the people and planet. And even though I could barely, I was paying 100% of my student stipend and rent, couldn't afford anything, the things that should now make me unhappy, I woke up with a soul. I woke up happy every day, looking forward to my day. Because money literally can't buy happiness. And society forced me to think that for a few years of my life, and thank God I'm not there anymore. What makes me happy is waking up every day and being able to do something that I can see as making a difference on the world for the planet and for the people. And that's kind of what got me into this whole into the policy side. I went to Vienna. It's called IASA, International Institute of Applied Systems Analyses. They're a top think tank that do a lot of good climate research. And their whole motto was doing science for policy. And so they basically were tackling the current policy issues and doing science in the timelines of policy. Because science is otherwise, like in academia, which is why I'm not in the traditional academia of professorship, can take forever. But policy cycles need faster answers. And so that's when that paper I mentioned that I published, I did that at IASA. And when I published it, I got contacted by the Indian government to use my model to look at the impacts of this big clean cooking program they had that got clean cooking access to over 80 million households in 2 to 3 years. That's almost twice the population of, or more than I think, twice the population of Canada. In 2 years, they got them energy access, right? So they wanted me to run my model and look at its climate impacts. And that's when I was like, wow, my research has directly impacted policy and people and the planet. And I was addicted at that point. I'm like, this is what I want to do. I want to work on energy policy and climate policy. And that's kind of what got me here. And so what I'm working on now, going back to that environmental finance, so this natural climate solutions part, I'm actually looking at how do we credit them, right? Because we need to fund them. If natural climate solutions in a 1.5 degree or a 2 degree pathway to 2030 can provide us with almost 30% of the required mitigation.
But we have to value it instead of valuing it only when we cut it down. We have to account and maintain the value of the natural ecosystem, and to do that is a huge accounting question.
Exactly, and so that's literally what I'm writing a handbook and a briefing note series with a team of experts and NGOs and indigenous community people, government. I'm working with them. Our first briefing note was actually published online on Earth Day. And if you go to EDF and look at natural climate solutions, you should be able to find it. It's basically saying, what does this mean, the role it can play, and we deal with issues like integrity of credits. We deal with issues of equity. How do we finance and value these systems, and how do we get the finance, which will be needed in billions of dollars? Where will this money come from? Will it be companies? Will it be governments? Will it be private? Where will it come from, and what would it look like, and what are these markets that we can create, which gets you into you believe in this free market capitalism. Are we trying to tap into that free market capitalism to actually fund environmental services, right? And so it's very interesting work that I'm doing, and our briefing notes should be coming out all through the year, and our handbook hopefully should be released sometime early next year.
Amazing.
That does sound fantastic, because a handbook is I'm very much don't give me the high-minded stuff. We're already fucked. Just let's get to work. But I mean, honestly, we're just I'm representative of probably 1 million or so people around the world who just tell me how should I measure it? How should I know where we are?
Exactly.
We need metrics. We need best practices. And having a handbook, so you don't need to be a researcher.
Exactly.
You can just be a manager. That's the thing. This is why I love a carbon tax too. You don't have to be an expert on emissions. All you got to do is just be a kitchen table economist and manage your budget and figure out where you can save it. And because you've linked currency to carbon, by reducing what you're spending, you're reducing your emissions.
I love the handbook idea from the perspective of someone who works in construction, and you pull out your handbook to figure out what size joist you need to put in your property. It makes things
more than that
easier,
too.
right?
But also imagine if you had a way to value the entire ecosystems of British Columbia, or Vancouver, whatever
Beyond
level.
just their cut down value.
Yes, exactly. What if it had value when it existed too? And what if you could figure out the loss of value that's happened in current development?
Because frankly, if we can value those ecosystem services our provide, like clean air, clean water, biodiversity, and all of that, the value is so much significantly more than the value of just the wood and the carbon.
Oh, absolutely.
In those trees.
And the other thing is, once you start valuing it and starting to treat it as a public asset, it's the way people get upset if you talk about selling off school land. And once you have a dollar, because people can appreciate that land has value, because it could be, if it's already developed, it could be redeveloped by somebody else. But if you start talking about, like, we can't sell off the value of our ecosystems, somebody that all of a sudden, if you put a value on it, this is a tautology, but if you put a value on it, then people will value it.
Exactly.
And this is a really thorny question, because from an engineering or business perspective, it's like, well, I know how much it costs to do something. I don't know how much it costs to not do something.
Devyani, you're going to have to leave soon. But before we get to the end, I want to talk about what can be done moving forward. And we are a social justice podcast here, so the focus is generally around equity. And my belief is that I want to see an equitable society. I don't believe I'll ever get there because, we've kind of touched on this previously, the issues globally around trying to accomplish that. But with that in mind, what are some of the steps that you both see as a path forward toward addressing the climate crisis in an equitable manner?
I think, I can start with that. I like to say that the climate crisis is it's an equity and justice issue. It's a social justice issue, is because when we look at the people who are the most impacted by the impacts of climate change, it's the marginalized, it's the developing world. We were chatting before the recording had started that, the global south or the developing countries, like in India, growing up in the 80s, I was seeing the impacts of climate change. In BC, we saw the real impacts last year, right? And then when we did see these impacts up here, who were the ones who suffered? It was the elderly, it was the marginalized, it was the poor who didn't have access to air conditioning or cooling spaces. So it has inequitable impacts when we talk about it. Where are all the coal plants? Where is all the toxic dumps? They're always in marginalized communities. Right?
Environmental racism.
Exactly, environmental racism. And so I think, when we deal with the climate crisis, there's two things that I'll talk from the policy side, because a lot of policy gets made. I think we need to review every policy with a climate lens and an equity lens. So if we're doing this policy, what will be the results? Even if it's, and it can be it can be housing policy, because we need to be making sure that these new houses are adaptable to the changing climate. They should also if these are, especially if they're affordable or lower income housing, then we definitely need to make sure they have good insulation and things like that, right? So look at it with an equity lens. How does this policy impact equity, the marginalized and all that, and how does it impact climate? And those are the two things that are very important to view every decision that is be it in a company or be it in an NGO, be it in a government setting. We should be having that equity, that social lens, and that climate lens for most of these decisions, if not all, that we make. And I think that's our way forward to get an equitable society and a livable planet which deals with climate change.
So the route forward would be sort of...
I just have a quick question about that. Sorry to interrupt. But the BC government actually has implemented that they are trying to account for gross human product for the first time in their new budget. Do you are you aware of it, or do you think that's they're following the right path?
I haven't heard of that.
No, it's a new one. It's going to be in the new budget. It's the first time today. This is the first year they're implementing it. This is both a cost and the equity human factor as well.
Well, that's good, because I've always said that we need to move away from purely GDP as an indicator, because that's GDP is just based on, as we know, more consumption, and consumption doesn't mean that people are doing better. And we have places like Bhutan that have the gross national happiness and things like we need to have other indicators, because we don't just need indicators of economic growth. We need indicators of human well-being, and we need to really look into that, because frankly, a happier population is a population that contributes more to the economy. Okay, and so if we want economic growth, we need a happy and we need to look at human well-being and look at everyone being happy, being able to provide for their needs, and a more just society.
And I heard in there about equitable policies being kind of a primary point that you're trying to make, is that we need equitable policies. So are policies how we achieve an end to the climate crisis or a solution to the climate
So,
crisis?
for the longest time, it's also like a lot of fossil fuel thing that they keep trying to put all the blame on individual actions. I'm not saying individual action isn't important. I'm not saying, buy a guzzling car and like keep it on because you're cold and like turn the heat on and not sit in your house. I'm not saying we need to take individual action, but let's not forget that the historical 70% of emissions is from these big companies, and that is what we need to do. And how do we do that? That's through policy, right?
Yes.
And given we are running out of time in terms of like the window, so you're saying this
28
window,
years.
exactly, the window we have to enact this change. The kind of change we need, the scale we need it at, it has to be through policy, and which is why I made, as you know, like I say you also made your foray into politics. I don't know, could have been for different reasons, but I made my foray into politics because I saw science was not being listened to, and this closing window, and I realized that really the way to get change is through policy. And so we really need to impact that, and then that policy needs to be equitable. And so
I think we got into politics for very similar reasons in terms of wanting to see equitable policy. It's just the policy I was pushing for at the time that I got into politics was around an equitable policy surrounding queer issues, and yours was around environmental issues. So two social justice issues, but two different ones.
exactly. Yeah.
And so over to you. Did you have some input on sort of the next steps?
Yes. There's two things I'd like to address. First is at the policy level, I would double down on everything Devyani said, depending on how you call it, the triple bottom line, an equity lens versus just an economic one. You can phrase it, I'm always talking about internalizing the costs of environmental and atmospheric degradation. That is why I am such, Margaret Thatcher turned me into a fan because if she likes a carbon tax, I like a carbon tax. Well, I guess, it's a conservative argument, but the argument of a carbon tax is it means you can't pollute for free, and the amount you pollute is internalize the cost. And as soon as it costs something, people are like, well, how can I spend less? How can I save money by doing this less? We need to internalize the costs of climate change more. And I am like, that's why the two policies I'm adamant on are we need to keep raising the carbon tax. The details can be revenue neutral, and rebated. It can be used to fund a mitigation and adaptation. Doesn't matter, but you need to keep raising the carbon tax, and not just continuously. Like that's what
It's nowhere close to what it should be to actually
but
price the externalities right now. I agree with you.
Yeah, but the second thing we need to do to complement it, to prevent carbon leakage to other nations beyond it, because we're still working in a frame of national sovereignty, and we're not going to overcome that in 28 years. You got to implement a carbon tariff on imports, so that this is a way that you have to, and this is a little more complicated, but you got to calculate the amount, if you're importing from places that don't have carbon prices or carbon taxes, you got to figure out how much carbon went into a product, and then apply the same rate of the carbon tax that you would to a domestic product to an imported product. That way you can't just outsource pollution. You need to be able to, those are the two policy things that beat the drum every damn day. That's these are still inadequate, but they're our most efficient ones to get us closer to the world we need to be. From a personal level, I would argue it's less about consumption choices, because we saw when the pandemic hit and everyone stayed at home, it made a marginal change in and also the stuff we could buy and the stuff we could do was what can you do in your living room? And it was just maybe a 5% reduction. And that's partly because people think of the stuff you buy as the only stuff you do, but it's the whole supply chain and the system of infrastructure. The whole economy is still running, and that still has all the emissions are mostly there. It's not what you do as a business to business is way more than business to consumer. So what I would say is don't worry about your consumption. If you want to be vegetarian or cut out, reduce the amount of meat, go for it. A collective action, if everyone ate less meat, they don't have to be vegetarian, but ate less meat would be a great start. But the real thing you could do is, in the same way that you're saying we need to apply a equity lens, I want every person who cares about climate change to ask a climate question in every sphere they're in. If you're what is it, a parent-teacher board? What is the school board doing to reduce its emissions or be climate resilient? If you're at your condo board, ask, what is the plan to reduce the building's emissions? At your business, what is the plan to reduce our business's emissions? If you're ask this at your job, ask this at a job application, ask this at your, like when you're trying to make a decision between two places, like, should I go here or there? Well, what's your climate plan? What's your climate reduction strategy, and what's your, and even if the details are almost unimportant, asking the question makes it more important. And once you start going down the process, you start measuring, and once you measure, you can manage. But too much is completely unmanaged, and we got to get people thinking. The second thing is, the last thing I'll say is, so that policy, personal, like you become, be an advocate, be a climate mitigation advocate in every circle you're in. Like,
that kind of is the essence of advocacy.
Exactly.
Is trying to extend.
Just ask the question in more places.
Exactly. What I tell people is be conscious about this.
Yes, and that's a great way to. The third thing, though, I'm going to say, and this is maybe where the political divide might run through. I'm just adamant that just vote to make sure that in your jurisdiction, climate change deniers don't reach office. I don't care about the details, but this is like strategic voting by another name. But I'm just like, just stop conservatives and Republicans from getting into office any damn where you can. Just that's it. Like, don't argue with me. Just like that's it. Stop
on
them.
that, I agree with you. I usually tell people, like, in every riding, like, forget about what party the person is running for. Pick the person, definitely, who you think will be the most willing to do the change on climate, and the person you believe in that riding.
I disagree. Right? You don't this is what I'm saying. With democracy isn't about believing in people. Democracy is so that we don't have to kill people to get them out of office. So I'm just like, vote for assholes that say climate change is real, and whoever has the best chance of winning against the conservative, like, because they're everyone on the right is already allied. If we stay fractured and worry about party or independent, it doesn't matter. Do you think climate change is real? Yeah, I don't care what party you're in.
I think the problem is that we end up in a situation where you have the two kind of main party candidates to vote for, but neither one of them really cares about climate. One of them might just be talking about it more than the other.
This is what I come back to when I say I'm of Ottawa. Nobody gives a backbenchers have no power, and it doesn't matter what they do. Whoever's going to represent you in Parliament, it'll make a difference if they can represent you and help you get access to social insurance or your government services. They're not the ones writing policy. All they do are a clapping seal that votes up or down the policy.
The whip vote.
Yeah. So I'm like, if we don't have this keeps coming up. Don't let conservatives win. It doesn't matter who does win as long as it's not a climate change denier.
See, for me, I feel like a climate policy for a person we vote for really does matter, because I think of climate change. Let's say we need to reduce. Let's say you're in a tank of water, right? You're stuck in a tank of water, and once the water hits above your nose, you're basically going to drown and die. And so at this point, a person saying that I'm going to stop the water from fully submerging you or stop it at your forehead, it doesn't matter, because unless you stop it below my mouth, I'm going to die. And so what I mean is, when you look at these, and we can agree to disagree. I'm just saying that personally, this is where I stand, is I wouldn't vote, I wouldn't say, don't let the person fully submerge you, let them just put you till your forehead, because you're still dead. And that's the way reducing emissions is going to do with climate change, is the marginalized. It doesn't matter if we don't hit the target that's needed, a little less or a little more, it's not going to make an impact.
I disagree entirely, actually, on that. That's actually something I disagree entirely from a scientific perspective. If we can't hit 1.5, we need to hit 2. If we can't hit 2, we need to hit 2.5. If we can't hit 2.5, we need to hit 3. If we can't hit 3, we got to hit 4.
I agree with you on that.
There actually is no place where the marginal impact stops. So actually, doing an inadequate half job is still better than doing no job. And we
I agree. I'm not saying that we should not do a job.
And it's not that. And when you simplify, if there's only one person on Earth, yes, you can't be half dead, but you can have half the number of people be dead.
Oh no, I agree with you. I tell people, they're like, we'll no longer hit 1.5, we should give up. I'm like, no, because if we can stop it at 1.6, we can stop it at 1.7.
If not 1.7, 1.8.
Because every degree is better. But what I mean is that you also need to, because so my thing is, it's like sending a signal, right? Also saying that we need our policies to be stronger.
Okay.
That's just how I think
and I just
it.
want to, and this is where the one thing I would say, and this is maybe where the line is again, I would argue you're arguing for greater advocacy, but that's not the same as electoral politics. And this is the thing: you can have the best policy per a period. Like Andrew Weaver is literally a climate scientist. He won his fraction of the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on the IPCC report, and he doubly deserves credit because he wasn't doing most of the research as a researcher. He was just doing it as a, trying to herd cats and keep everything on the rails, and that's way harder. So Andrew Weaver deserves the most credit, but he still didn't win enough seats. Andrew Weaver, you can be the most qualified, but you gotta win elections to implement anything. And you could make the argument that he influenced stuff but if you don't win, you don't get a point, especially in a parliamentary system. There's no points for second place.
So I think using BC as an example is really good because we have an instance where we've got a BC Liberal Party, a BC NDP Party, and a BC Green Party. And you're talking about the BC Greens under their old leader not getting enough seats to have, I guess, the sway to create the kind of changes that are necessary, the policy changes in order to protect the environment. Is that right?
No, what I'm saying is that they were able to win where they were strong, they could win seats and they could use those. But where they were not strong, voting, and this is we're not going to change first past the post just by wanting it to be different. And the truth is, if you're voting for a third or fourth party candidate, I'm not saying you're throwing your vote away, but I am saying you're indifferent to which of the two front runners are going to win. I'm actually very critical of Green Party voters in the United States because especially in, I think it's Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, Hillary Clinton lost by a cumulative 77,000 votes, which is smaller than the number of people that voted for the Green Party in those states. And you could say Hillary Clinton is a warmonger, awful, really, everything you could say bad about Hillary Clinton is probably true. But the difference was, for people that are part of the Green Party, so nominally believe in climate change and think it's a pressing concern, when given the choice between two candidates that could be president and one that says it's a climate change is a hoax, or we need to do inadequate but real things to choose it, those 77,000 voters said, I don't care, there's no difference between the two, and I'll just vote for a candidate who has no chance of being president.
But that's also assuming that Green Party voters are single-issue voters that only care about the environment.
Yes, right? I can make that assumption, though, because you can't say you're a Green Party voter and don't care about climate change.
Yes, but they care for more. They might care for more other policies that they believe in with the Greens, right? Like what I
know plenty of people that don't care about the environment who vote Green because they're concerned about other issues that the party stands for.
That's what I think you were saying is that they might care for more. Like it's not like they don't care about climate, but they care for more than just climate.
Sure,
I don't think it would be fair to think that if let's say the Green Party was removed in those areas, that all of them would have voted for Hillary.
No, it doesn't matter about the party. I'm blaming the voters.
No, but what I think Nicola is saying is that if they didn't vote Green, there's no guarantee they wouldn't have actually voted
I'm saying
conservative.
My point is that if they overcame all the obstacles to vote in the United States, which are significant, they actually got to the ballot box and got to mark something. And it's and this is the thing, it is I'm sorry, it's 28 years now. It was, it was 37 when I started my master's, just at 2050. I just used 2050 as an arbitrary deadline because you gotta keep a focus somewhere. But I am adamant on this. If you want to be an advocate, but don't run for office then, because the power of being in office is what you can do in committee and in Parliament. And if you're not in Parliament, you're not in Parliament.
Actually, the funny thing was, before you arrived, I was chatting with Devyani about this. I think there's more power in running for office than being elected.
That is not true. I'm sorry, but this is what conservatives understand better. Trump, the power that Trump had by winning, you got to read. I know you have to run.
What's the time?
Oh,
I gotta go.
Okay,
you gotta
sorry.
run. Take care, Devyani. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Devyani.
I want to finish this point though because we saw the implication of the, running for office gives you more influence than being in office. If that was true, then Roe v. Wade wouldn't be on the cusp of being eradicated right now. The power that Trump had to appoint justices. Even by
I'm talking about individuals, right?
Individuals.
Roe v. Wade's not getting overturned by an individual.
It is being overturned by 5 individuals, 3 of whom were appointed by Trump when he was in office.
Right, but you're talking about collective.
No, I'm saying if we're talking about running for office, it makes you more influential than
being a single seat in a government.
I really don't think if you are more influential outside of Parliament than you are inside of Parliament, you shouldn't be running for office then because you're saying that the best case scenario, The worst case scenario then is that you would win.
Not necessarily.
Like,
So it's not to say that
Don't ru- if you
because I
ran-
think you can create change just through the actual process of running for election, whether or not you get elected. So if you get elected, it's sort of icing on the cake, because not only do you get to create awareness around the issues that you care for in the process of getting elected, but now you're elected and get to create change that way. But I think there's a lot more power in being an advocate than there is in being a single voice in a huge room.
Okay, but the argument I would make to counter that is, what is it about running for office that is different from anything you can do as an advocate outside of Parliament?
You're given a massive platform by the press.
Yes, but there are other, the whole thing about that is, quite frankly, you built a platform before you ran for office.
No, I gained my platform because I ran for office.
I thought you had your podcast and all that before that. Maybe I'm
the
losing the track.
2017 election is the only reason people know about me.
Oh, okay.
That's why I have that viewpoint.
Right. And here's the thing though. Do you think you had more of an impact on that than, say, Andrew Weaver?
On what?
I mean, on
I think
the environmental policy.
When it comes to queer people getting involved in the Green Party, and
I'm not
'cause
saying don't
my
be involved
issues
in
are
the
related to that. It's related to wanting to create policy changes within the party by working on the EDI committee, things like that. I think that I created more change within the party by being an advocate than I would have if I'd been an elected
Change
official.
within the party, though.
Right, because that was
Yes.
my focus.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you were saying change in the society, but if you're talking about in the party, sure.
I think it's kind of one and the same, because my focus at the time that kind of got me the recognition that I have was by focusing on creating change within the party and also within my riding specifically, which is why I ran in that area. But it's also the exposure that I gained through that process that's given me a platform for all of my advocacy work.
Right. And that's an interesting take, but I also would say we're still, if we're talking about electoral parliamentary, who determines policy? The parliamentarians.
Yes, absolutely. I just think that unless you hold the balance of power, an individual doesn't have a lot of sway. Unless you're the party whip, maybe.
No, but I'm saying unless you hold the balance of power, in marginal ridings, the voters do. And that's why I'm saying to be on the last day of if it's an election and the person you love or really support, the best person, isn't in second place or first place, I would really say the average person has to have a really hard look and look at the numbers and say, even though they're not the person I want to be in power, the chances are, the Hail Mary that the person I love, that they will win. It's such a remote there's a much bigger possibility that somebody who thinks climate change is a hoax and will actively stymie the process, if there's a bigger chance that they could get in than the person you personally love. I vote for people I hate. I just hate them less than their opponents.
So I would agree with you in certain circumstances. If I could easily rank my candidates 1, 2, and 3, and my third place, I'm there's no chance third place is coming in.
Yeah.
Okay,
ballot.
hold your nose and vote for second place. But my issue when I look at our local elections between the BC Liberals and the BC NDP,
Those aren't local. Those are provincial. The local.
When I'm looking for my
municipal
local
ones,
candidates running
Okay.
for those parties, I should have said.
Okay, sorry.
So, because I'm trying to decide which person I'm going to vote for to be my MLA, and I'm basing that both on who they are as people, but also on the parties. And I primarily base it on the party because of the fact that their votes are whipped.
Yeah.
If their votes weren't whipped, I would base it more on the individual. But I don't see a distinction between those two parties as one being better than the other.
And between the Liberals and the
NDP.
Okay, and that's legit. You could make the argument that the Gordon Campbell made a bigger contribution to reducing climate change through the invention of the carbon tax. There's an ugly argument you could make that Gordon Campbell is probably, and I
would argue Gordon Campbell was better than Christy Clark.
I would argue the thing, and this is really something that I had cut this out of the episode because it will get me beaten. Now, with Devyani on, I do want to take the opportunity, just because of my aerospace background, to talk about one element of the climate crisis that is, it's uglier than strategic voting, let's put it that way. But it is something that's always on, it's so controversial, it's do we even put this on the table to talk about? And it's and that is geoengineering.
Okay.
So usually when we're talking about climate change mitigation or adaptation, we are talking about how to stop changing the climate. That's because we are changing it, so that's mitigation. And adaptation is how do we, and our human systems, sort of cope with a changing world. but we're, to quote a certain political philosopher who you might have heard of, Dick Marx or Richard Marx, I don't know. It's Karl Marx, that's it. No, you might not have heard. He's like, some say the point of philosophy is not to describe the world. I think I'm misquoting, but the point of philosophy is not to describe the world, but to change it. There are those who say, well, instead of trying to adapt to climate change, why don't we engineer the climate and cut out the middle person, and just why don't we just if there's too much energy coming in, if the energy is coming in is constant but not enough getting out, why don't we change some of the elements of the balance? And it's not about putting less carbon dioxide in. It's not even about pulling carbon dioxide out of the. It's usually not considered pulling carbon dioxide out by carbon sequestration, but there's ideas of we could drop huge amounts of iron filings into the ocean, in the middle of the ocean, to create algae blooms, so that all these algae, most of the oceans don't have enough iron for significant plant life. So you drop a ton of iron in the deep cell, you get an algae bloom, all that plant life sucks out carbon, forms, and then what? Who knows? But we suck out the carbon first, so
Right.
We're, the carbon.
So it's kind of extending beyond Devyani's natural climate solutions and going into unnatural climate solutions.
Yes, and the argument about where, usually, and there isn't a hard line. Some of these are about being more encouraging of natural processes and systems and helping that along. Others are about just actively, the difference between foraging and farming. Individually, foraging and farming could be considered pretty close, but the difference that it has on the environment is significant.
Right. And we can already, we already do things like that as far as, I guess, maybe on a smaller scale, creating unnatural snowfalls or creating precipitation in areas where there wouldn't otherwise be precipitation. Right?
Yes, and that's cloud seeding. Now, cloud seeding, and just to be clear, we're not talking about snow machines on a ski hill, not geoengineering, but having a plane release, I think it's silver nitrate particles high in the air to produce more clouds, so the precipitation will rain out. That is small-scale geoengineering. Now, there's a lot of different ones that get contemplated, and it depends on how sci-fi you really want to get. One of them is we literally deploy a shield in space at the focal point between the sun and the Earth to block out a percentage of the sunlight.
I've actually heard about that as a concept.
Yes, and it's I run some background. As an aerospace engineer, it's you only using air. I can't evaluate some of the biological ones. I don't know dumping a ton of iron into the South Atlantic doesn't seem like a great idea, but what do I know? It's not like the stuff we've been dumping in is a good idea anyway. So maybe it's a trade-off.
The plastic island floating out
there.
Yeah,
it's a trade-off. But the two ones I always come to, because I hate the building the solar shade out there. It's theoretically, okay, let's say, you can build, how do you launch millions of little satellites? You'd have to launch millions and millions because you have to keep replenishing them because they'll die, or they won't die, satellites don't die. They'll malfunction and get out of formation. So you have to keep launching a bunch of satellites, and how do you launch millions of them when, we're already talking about something that's costing trillions of dollars, but it could be done, but it's probably more expensive than just doing the stuff we should be doing anyway. On the other side, but that's definitely out there. And as the least, it's one of those things. Well, since it's off the Earth, the blowback is probably going to be less than some of the other options. Of course, the whole thing is literally, because of the way you could control it, you're literally entering Bond villain technology, where if you can block the sun, even just a few parts, you could you could turn satellites on and off, so they could allow sun on, more sun on South America, less on India, more, you could. It's 100%. Bond villain super weapon, just promise and don't do that, and
right, which is kind of ultimately the direction our society is kind of going in with the advancements of technology. Is there's going to be a lot of instances where
but it's also how do you control something like that? Is it just the spacefaring nations? Does the UN have jurisdiction? There's a lot of issues, but even this one is one of the least impactful because at least it's outside the atmosphere. One of the most contentious is the idea. There's one idea that we need more cloud. If you have more clouds over the ocean, And then, blue is darker than white and gray, so it'll absorb more light will be reflected off the oceans back into space, so that'll be better, less energy gets absorbed. But if you create a lot more clouds over the ocean, that affects all the precipitation. And it's like, whoa, now we're talking about weather dynamics, which is so chaotic. And the chaos doesn't mean random, it means susceptible to tiny initial conditions that can't be determined and appear random, but aren't. Like we have no, the rain, butterfly in Spain causing,
The butterfly effect?
Yeah, the butterfly effect is chaos theory. And so it's like, whoa, we are rolling the dice so much on this, like we don't even know if making more clouds over the ocean is a help or a hindrance. So
Right.
but that's at the other end, where if you're messing around with the atmosphere, you don't know what you're doing.
Right, because right now we already are messing around with the
Yes, that's
atmosphere.
the thing,
and
we
we're just
all
doing
do
it
it.
without any kind of...
We're not doing it
without any
plan.
intent of doing something
Yeah.
positive.
Yes, but the one I want to bring up, because this is one where the idea that you would fire tiny particles of sulfate. So remember before I said about silver nitrate particles can be used to... Silver nitrate particles you can have water vapor in the atmosphere. Water vapor is clear. You don't see water vapor. You only see water vapor when it condenses back into water droplets. That's a cloud. Silver nitrate makes it easier for the water vapor already in the atmosphere to condense around it and form water droplets. Makes more clouds.
Okay.
More clouds means more rain. That's that kind of small particle. Very small. Sulfates are, on the other hand, the idea that you would launch, you blast all these you launch all these particles above the cloud layer, and they reflect sunlight back out into space. And we know this works. We actually know that high atmospheric sulfates do lower the temperature of the Earth, because this is what happens when volcanoes erupt.
Right.
And, we actually can measure the effect. Like Mount Pinatubo, if I'm pronouncing that right, in the Philippines, created a huge cooling for a year or two. But it has to be sent way above the cloud layer, like probably twice as high. You have to get it into the stratosphere so it doesn't get cycled out with the rain.
So correct me if I'm wrong. I seem to recall there was the theory around an asteroid hitting Earth, killing off dinosaurs, but also sparking mass volcanic eruptions, which then covered the entire globe in smoke. Am I combining two different?
You're thinking of the Deccan Traps mass extinction, which was about 300 million years ago.
Okay.
And that wasn't that it covered in smoke as much as it also used up the amount of magma was so significant it acidified the oceans and consumed most of the oxygen. Whereas the dinosaurs, they were already having a decreasing decreasing oxygen concentration in the atmosphere, but the asteroid hitting would have been the asteroid was the last straw that broke the camel's back. The dinosaurs were on the decline, but it wasn't massive volcanic eruptions. The Deccan Traps, which was a separate mass extinction event, hundreds of millions of years earlier, was that.
And I might be combining this because the video that I'd watched on it was around what would happen if an asteroid were to hit and the impact it would have on us. So it might have been that was combining it, or it could be that I'm remembering two different things that I looked into.
It's one of these things where you say, a giant asteroid isn't going to hit the Earth and wipe us all out, no matter how much we wish it would. But no, the thing I want to get to is, so there's the whole idea, well, you'd have to spray enough of these sulfates to cover the whole world, and there's the atmosphere will literally look yellow, and it'll have all these problems because not enough sunlight's coming down to the fields for the crops or solar panels, and it doesn't do anything to address the ocean acidification, which happens from having CO2 in the atmosphere, and that's all true. And this is where it gets really scary, though, because once you say limited stratospheric sulfate particles only over the poles. So the idea would be that the poles are the most at risk because especially Greenland and Antarctica, those are the ones that, and also the sea level, the sea ice over the Arctic. Like sea ice over the Arctic, when it melts, the more time you have open ocean, the more time it's blue, it absorbs more energy. So if we could keep the Arctic and the Antarctic a few degrees colder, just to it'd be an exercise to buy us some time, right?
And you can control where those particles sit on the Earth?
Oh, well, it's more about if you put it at a high enough altitude, it's above where the weather is, so it doesn't get rained out. Like most of the weather patterns that go around the Earth, the stuff in the Arctic and the Antarctic, more or less, they're not, the particles you put up there aren't going to stay up forever. So you have to replenish them. And if they're not going to stay up forever, it means if you do it mostly go for the Antarctic and the Arctic, there's going to be less, at the non-Arctic and Arctic places because they're not being replenished and they are coming out of the atmosphere eventually. But the amount, the whole thing was, it would be a huge industrial endeavor to put this mass of sulfates into the stratosphere, because it takes really power. You'd either have to fire them up with cannons, or you'd have to have all these airplanes flying into the stratosphere. The thing about it was, I always thought this was impossible because of the number of flights you'd need would be, ridiculous. You could never achieve this. But when I ran the numbers, this is one of the scariest things I ever found. And I actually found this at a UBC class in an exercise, and it actually made me say, I think we need to put geoengineering on the table, because it actually could work, and that's a risk. The amount of flights it would take to, say, to put a noticeable amount of sulfates over the Arctic and Antarctic is achievable with the number of airplanes the U.S. Air Force contains alone. That's not even talking about the entire U.S. Armed Forces. That's not even talking about all the commercial airplanes that exist in the United States. That's not even talking about the whole military aviation. That's not even talking about all the planes in the world. The U.S. Air Force theoretically has enough planes that they could just start doing. If this was a U.S. Air Force policy, they would have the means by which they could achieve this plan. Geoengineering is scary because in all the ways that makes climate change hard to address, it's diffuse. If you don't all work together, it's pointless. It's expensive in the long run, but cheap in the short run. Geoengineering is scary because it's the almost exact opposite. It's like anti-pollution, whereas it's cheap in the short term, and it's expensive in the short term, but cheap in the long run. A single actor can make a big difference no matter what the rest of them do. And with something, so it really starts getting into the point, instead, it's so hard to get global consensus on anything. That's why things are moving so slowly. That's the biggest answer I can give you why things are moving so slowly, because it doesn't work unless you have global consensus, and it's hard to get global consensus. This would be achievable that not only could one nation do this, even a sub-nation could do this. Or thank fucking dog that Elon Musk hasn't gotten this in his head, because Elon Musk, or a billionaire or two, could do this. They'd have the capacity to do this. And
do you think that's what we're destined for then? If our global actors are not willing to take...
No fate but what you make. And I don't want to say... I don't like the term destined, because then it becomes a fallback option. I am very concerned, though, that we're going to make it a necessity through inaction.
I mean, it almost seems like the inaction is potentially leading us towards that, because we're already seeing so much inaction. It seems like governments, or our leaders, whatever you want to call them, are just waiting until a magical, easy solution comes up, and it sounds like that might be what they would latch onto in that case.
It isn't magical. The real thing is, that's why a lot of people find it controversial to even bring up geoengineering on the table, because it seems like a get-out-of-jail-free card. But it isn't. And this is what I really want to emphasize. Out of all the problems, it could buy us some time to keep the Arctic and Antarctic from going into a catastrophic meltdown. It doesn't solve any of the other problems. Ocean acidification is still a problem. We still have temperature rise globally. We still have the drought. In fact, it's shown that we'd probably have more droughts with less temperature rise by doing this. So it's all about huge trade-offs, but who gets to make the trade-offs?
Well, and I'm not so much thinking of it as that one being the thing that everyone around the world latches onto, but that's not the only type of geoengineering that there is, right?
No.
You've talked about dumping things in the ocean, so is it, I suppose, is it possible that governments are going to latch onto these as being solutions when combined together, and in fact end up, maybe they are solutions, or maybe they end up being horribly detrimental and destroying our planet completely?
And I hate to say it, it's unlikely that not any of these. Some of these, if you want to create new, bacteria, creating new life forms is on the table. But if you get it wrong, you could really crash the ecosystem. But the argument is, a lot of people say, yeah, you don't know what the side effects of this are. You really don't. This could go sideways, and that'd be at the best of time. It could go sideways while working, and that's optimistic. What if it goes sideways and doesn't work? But it's still like, but compared to, you know, it might if you look at the trade-offs, like compared to climate change, like, the impacts of climate change are so awful and unevenly distributed. So it's like, you know, what if I brought up Indonesia for example? What if like Indonesia doesn't have the capacity, but let's pretend an equatorial country that does have the capacity to do it, decides to start spraying sulfates over the Arctic and Antarctic. Now the Antarctic, the Antarctic is a non-nation state that is no nation. There are lots of nations in the Arctic that would that claim it as their airspace, and like even if you didn't land there, you're flying through the U.S., Russia, the EU, and Canada's airspace. And let's say you start spraying something there, and they're all like, "This is having a negative effect on us," and the equatorial nation is like, "Damn your effect on us! The sea level rise is having a much bigger impact on us. Who are you to say we can't do this when your inaction is flooding us?"
Right.
And but that's also like literally how acts of war. There could be geoengineering, because of the inequitable impact or uneven impact. You can make the argument of, is that equitable? The equity thing goes in the other direction with geoengineering. Does the
I think
it could lead to nuclear war.
Yeah, and I think about how difficult it was just for Chris Hadfield to put out a song while in space because of all the different airspaces he was going over, or something along those lines, right? Like something as simple as that, or seemingly
Copyright
simple,
law,
right, has, because of the impact of having various nations on Earth, has become problematic, and now that song doesn't exist in the way that it could if it was filmed on, you know, on U.S. soil, for instance. But it takes it to like this massive level where you're having a huge impact on other countries and potentially breaking out in wars.
I mean, this was one of those things, like, especially, and I do want to bring this up because when do the stakes get high enough that we're willing to, like, the whole thing is we need to use mitigation and adaptation because those are greater certainties and lesser chances of blowback. Geoengineering is, things are getting really desperate here, and we might have to, but it's also like things are going to get really desperate if we don't do it too. Like when Devyani was talking about, like, when the monsoon rains fail, that leads farmers to suicide and all that. That is the best case scenario. If the monsoon rains failed in an uneven way between Pakistan and India, they're both nuclear-armed nations. We cannot ignore the fact that what's the worst case scenario? Climate change drives us into a nuclear war. That's honestly, I don't see a worse outcome than that.
Right, just the absolute destruction of the planet, essentially.
Or the human population, at least.
Yeah, I mean, the planet will find a way to recover, surely, on its own.
Yes, but I mean, when we start, this is something, as an aerospace engineer, partly because of my connection to those atomic weapons that will kill us all in a fiery hellstorm 30 minutes from launch, partly because of the connection between aerospace engineering, nuclear weapons, climate change, and all, is why I always think we need to talk about the ugliest solution of geoengineering, because it might get to a point where people, nations, and governments may see it as less ugly than the inaction we're doing now.
Yeah, I mean, procrastinate enough, and I can definitely see us getting to that point.
Yeah. That's, so I want to bring it up not because it's fun, not because I think it's a good idea, but I really, like, when we talk about we have 28 years, well, we don't have time to do it.
I view that as motivation to, like, get going now, so we don't end up in that situation where we're having those last resorts that could potentially end up in catastrophic death for all of us.
And that's why I want to bring it up. That's why I wanted to stay and have this last sort of post-credit scene, just because, like, and Devyani could weigh in on it if they have comments too. I'm sure they could give a written note, but this is something especially within my wheelhouse between aerospace engineering, clean energy engineering.
Yeah, I think that was a really good point to bring up, and I think it's good for the audience to be able to ponder what that means, and maybe it'll drive some people to want to take action sooner rather than later by just understanding how dire the situation could be if we don't act now.
Yeah, because the ethical thing would be, if you were a leader of a nation where you were going through famine because of it, because, you know, richer nations didn't want to do anything, and you had the ability to start changing the climate on your own, or in conjunction with maybe the next billionaire will get this be under their bonnet.
Yeah, I mean,
we need to think about the first thing. We need to have this on the table to have the research to understand what are the consequences and what are the worst case scenarios, but mainly we need a global framework to be able to address this before we need it.
Absolutely.
That's the scary thing. We need to have either a global convention that says geoengineering cannot be done unilaterally, or that one that says it cannot be done, period.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever, we need a global legal framework to address geoengineering before it happens, because after the fact, it will be too late. In
Right.
fact, it could be a war.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting too, because we're going to be exploring throughout I guess maybe it'd be the first year or so of this podcast, when we're going through all of the subjects from a social justice coloring book that I designed. They're all sort of higher level, like climate crisis or mental health. But we're going to see so much overlap between the different issues. Like you're talking about how various nations are coming together in the inequality.
The climate crisis makes every social justice issue worse.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining today. If the audience missed it, Devyani had to head out not too long ago, and that's why we've been finishing off the conversation, just the two of us. But I really appreciated that added input around geoengineering and what that looks like for the future, and why we need to act now in order to avoid ending up in a horrible, dire situation. So to end on that heavy note, I guess what I would hope that the audience takes away is that we should be talking to the people around us, trying to encourage everyone to make changes in their lives and to try to create policy changes at a government level. Basically just having those conversations wherever you can to try to get people to realize the urgency. Thank you for tuning in to a social justice podcast. Tune in again in another 2 weeks for our next topic. All of our topics are based off of a social justice coloring book, and a social justice podcast is brought to you by the Flag Shop. And until next time, have a great day. You've been listening to a social justice podcast hosted by Nicholas Sperling, brought to you by the Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book.